Look at your hand right now. Really look at it. Whatever shade it is, from the palest cream to the deepest brown, that color is telling a story. A story that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, across continents and through ice ages, through migrations and mutations, and the relentless pressure of natural selection. But here's what most people don't realize. That story doesn't start with diversity. It starts with everyone looking exactly the same. Every single human alive 200,000 years ago had dark skin. Not brown, not tan, dark. The kind of deep, rich pigmentation you see in people from equatorial Africa today. There were no pale Europeans wandering around ancient savannas, no light-skinned Asians exploring prehistoric forests, just dark-skinned humans, all of them, living in the place where our species was born. Africa. This isn't speculation. This is written in our genes, confirmed by our fossils, supported by everything we understand about human evolution. When Homo sapiens first emerged as a distinct species, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago, probably in Eastern Africa, they had dark skin. Because in Africa, under that brutal equatorial sun, dark skin wasn't just an advantage, it was a requirement for survival. Think about the environment our ancestors evolved in. The African savanna, where the sun beats down with an intensity that people in northern latitudes can barely imagine, where there's no escaping the heat, no hiding from ultraviolet radiation that can literally destroy the molecules that keep you alive. This was home for millions of years, not just for Homo sapiens, but for all our hominin ancestors stretching back through Homo erectus, Homo habilis, all the way to the Australopithecines. And all of them, every single one, had dark skin. We know this, even though skin doesn't fossilize. We know it because of melanin, the pigment that makes skin dark, and what it does. Melanin is extraordinary. It's a complex polymer produced by specialized cells called melanocytes that sit in the deepest layer of your skin. These cells manufacture melanin and package it into tiny granules called melanosomes, which are then distributed to the surrounding skin cells. The more melanin you produce, the darker your skin becomes. But melanin isn't decorative. It's functional, critically, essentially functional. Melanin absorbs ultraviolet radiation. UV light, the kind that pours down from the sun in equatorial Africa with unrelenting intensity, is dangerous. It penetrates skin cells and starts breaking apart the DNA inside them. It generates reactive oxygen species, free radicals that cause cellular damage. It destroys essential molecules floating in your bloodstream. Without protection, this UV damage accumulates, causing mutations that lead to cancer, destroying vitamins necessary for survival, making reproduction itself difficult or impossible. Melanin stops this. Dark skin, loaded with eumelanin, the black-brown pigment that provides the most UV protection, acts like a natural sunscreen. It absorbs 90% or more of the UV radiation that hits it, preventing that radiation from reaching the vulnerable cells beneath. It's so effective that scientists estimate dark skin provides a sun protection factor of about 13 to 24, depending on exactly how dark it is. For our ancestors living under the African sun, this protection was literally life or death. And the molecule it was protecting, more than any other, was folate. Folate, also known as vitamin B9, is one of the most important molecules in your body. It's essential for DNA synthesis, which means it's essential for cell division, which means it's essential for growth, for healing, for reproduction. When you're pregnant, folate is critical for the developing fetus. Without enough folate, neural tube defects occur, spina bifida, anencephaly, catastrophic developmental problems that can kill a baby before it's even born. And ultraviolet radiation destroys folate. Specifically, UVA and UVB radiation break down folate circulating in the bloodstream. Studies have shown that just an hour of exposure to simulated sunlight can reduce folate levels in light-skinned individuals by up to 50%. In a world without vitamin supplements, without folate-fortified foods, this wasn't just a health problem, this was an evolutionary crisis. In the 1990s, anthropologists Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin started connecting these dots. They looked at satellite data mapping ultraviolet radiation across the globe, data from NASA showing exactly how much UV hits every spot on Earth's surface. Then they compared that to anthropological records of indigenous skin colors in different populations. The correlation was stunning, almost perfect. Where UV radiation was highest, skin was darkest. But correlation isn't causation. They needed a mechanism. Why would natural selection favor dark skin in high UV environments? Skin cancer was an obvious answer, but it didn't quite work. Skin cancer, particularly melanoma, is deadly, yes, but it typically strikes after reproductive age. From an evolutionary perspective, dying of melanoma at 60 doesn't matter if you've already had children. Natural selection doesn't care what happens to you after you've passed on your genes. Folate was different. Folate affected reproduction directly. Low folate levels in pregnant women led to miscarriages and birth defects. Low folate in men reduced sperm production and fertility. This was selection at its most powerful. Individuals with lighter skin living in high UV environments would have had their folate destroyed by sunlight. They would have had more miscarriages, more children with birth defects, lower fertility. Only those with dark skin, with enough melanin to protect their folate from UV destruction, would have reproduced successfully. This is why all early humans were dark. This is why every fossil we've found from early Homo sapiens in Africa shows skeletal and dental features consistent with populations that would have had dark pigmentation. This is why genetic studies of the MC1R gene, one of the major genes controlling melanin production, show almost no variation in African populations. The gene that codes for dark skin has been under such intense positive selection for so long that mutations reducing pigmentation were eliminated almost as soon as they appeared. Our ancestors were dark because Africa is bright. Because the sun at the equator doesn't play favorites, doesn't ease up, doesn't give you a break. Because folate is essential and UV radiation destroys it. Because dark skin was the difference between having children who survived and having children who didn't. Because natural selection doesn't care about beauty standards or social preferences, it cares about reproduction. And in equatorial Africa, dark skin meant reproductive success. For millions of years, this was stable. Australopithecines were dark. Homo erectus was dark. Homo heidelbergensis was dark. All the way through the emergence of Homo sapiens, darkness was the norm, the baseline, the universal human condition. When you picture early humans walking across the African landscape 200,000 years ago, hunting, gathering, beginning to develop the complex behaviors that would eventually lead to art and language and civilization, picture them with skin as dark as the darkest modern Africans. And this would have continued indefinitely, except for one thing. Humans didn't stay in Africa. Around 70,000 years ago, some of them left. They walked north and east, following coastlines and river valleys, moving into environments their bodies had never encountered before. Environments where the sun was weaker, where winter brought darkness that lasted for months, where their dark skin, so perfectly adapted to African UV levels, suddenly became a liability. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about how humans became white, we need to understand why they left Africa at all, where they went, and what happened when their African bodies met non-African environments. If you're still listening, if this journey through deep time is helping you drift off, or just making you think differently about the skin you're in, do me a favor. Drop a comment telling me where you are right now. Tokyo at 3 a.m. London at midnight? Somewhere I've never heard of? I love seeing how we're all connected across time zones, all curious about the same ancient questions. And if you want more deep dives into human evolution, hit subscribe, because this story is just getting started. The thing about being dark-skinned in Africa is that it worked perfectly. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors thrived under the equatorial sun, protected by melanin, their bodies optimized for the environment they evolved in. It was the solution. It was exactly what natural selection had crafted over millions of years of hominin evolution. But evolution doesn't plan ahead. It doesn't prepare you for environments you haven't encountered yet. And when some humans decided to leave Africa, they were walking into a world their bodies weren't designed for. They were carrying African adaptations into non-African environments. And one of those adaptations, dark skin, was about to become a problem that would change the very appearance of our species. The first thing to understand about the migration out of Africa is that it wasn't a single event. It wasn't a conscious decision where some group of humans said, "Let's leave Africa and colonize the world." Driven by climate shifts and population pressures, and probably just the restless human tendency to see what's over the next hill. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, tried leaving Africa multiple times over the past 200,000 years. Some of these early attempts may have reached the Middle East, possibly even further, but most of these early migrations ultimately failed. They didn't establish lasting populations. They died out, leaving behind a few fossils and stone tools as the only evidence they ever existed. The migration that mattered, the one that led to all non-African populations alive today, happened around 70 to 60,000 years ago. This was when a relatively small group of humans, maybe just a few thousand individuals, successfully left northeastern Africa and made it into the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. Every person of non-African ancestry alive today descends from this single population. Every European, every Asian, every Native American, every Pacific Islander, all of us trace back to these few thousand pioneers who walked out of Africa in the depths of prehistory. And all of them had dark skin, the same dark skin their ancestors had carried for hundreds of thousands of years, the same melanin-rich pigmentation that had protected them in Africa. They didn't know it yet, but this protection was about to become a problem. The humans who left Africa around 70,000 years ago were walking into the unknown, not just geographically unknown, though certainly that. They were entering environments that no Homo sapiens had ever successfully colonized before. Environments where the fundamental rules of survival were different from anything their species had experienced. Picture the route they took. Most evidence suggests they followed a coastal path, moving along the shores of the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula, then eastward along the coastlines of South Asia. This wasn't a march. This wasn't a purposeful expedition. It was probably a gradual drift, populations expanding into adjacent territories, generation after generation, following food sources, seeking new hunting grounds, moving into empty ecological niches. But the world they were entering was profoundly different from the one they were leaving. In Africa, particularly equatorial Africa, where humans had evolved, the sun is intense year-round. There's minimal seasonal variation in daylight length. The angle of the sun stays high in the sky. Ultraviolet radiation pounds down relentlessly, day after day, month after month, year after year. This is what dark skin evolved for. This is what melanin was protecting against. The further north these migrants traveled, the more that changed. At higher latitudes, the sun's angle drops. It never gets directly overhead. During winter months, it barely clears the horizon. The path that UV radiation has to travel through the atmosphere gets longer and longer, and more of that radiation gets scattered and absorbed before it reaches the ground. By the time you get to northern Europe or northern Asia, UV radiation levels are a fraction of what they are at the equator. The numbers are stark. At the equator, annual UV radiation averages around 12,000 joules per square meter. At 50 degrees north latitude, roughly the latitude of London or southern Canada, that drops to around 4,000 joules per square meter, a third of the UV. Less than a third in winter. For our dark-skinned African migrants, this created a problem they couldn't have anticipated. Because while their melanin was still dutifully blocking UV radiation, protecting their folate from being destroyed, it was also blocking something else, something they desperately needed: vitamin D. Vitamin D is weird. It's not really a vitamin in the traditional sense. It's actually a hormone precursor that your body manufactures in your skin when ultraviolet radiation hits it. Specifically, when UVB radiation strikes a cholesterol compound in your skin cells called 7-dehydrocholesterol, it converts it into pre-vitamin D3, which then transforms into vitamin D3. Your body uses this vitamin D to regulate calcium absorption, maintain bone health, support immune function, and control hundreds of other biological processes. Here's the catch. This process requires UV radiation. Not a lot, but enough. In equatorial Africa, Even with dark skin blocking 90% of UV, enough gets through to produce adequate vitamin D. The sun is so intense that even the 10% that penetrates dark skin is sufficient. But at higher latitudes, with UV levels already reduced by atmospheric scattering and the sun's low angle, and then with dark skin blocking most of what remains, the amount of UV reaching the vitamin D production layers of skin drops below the threshold needed for adequate synthesis. The result is vitamin D deficiency, and vitamin D deficiency is serious. In children, it causes rickets, a disease where bones fail to mineralize properly. The skeleton becomes soft and deformed. Legs bow under the body's weight, the ribcage distorts, the skull doesn't develop correctly. This isn't just cosmetic. Severe rickets is crippling. In evolutionary terms, it's deadly. In women of childbearing age, rickets causes pelvic deformities that make childbirth difficult or impossible. The birth canal narrows, making it hard for a baby's head to pass through. Before modern medicine, this meant death during childbirth for both mother and child. Even milder vitamin D deficiency affects fertility, increases the risk of pregnancy complications, and weakens the immune system. Natural selection doesn't care about your skin color. It cares about whether you successfully reproduce. And dark-skinned individuals living in low UV environments were struggling. They were developing rickets. They were having difficult births. Their children were dying from complications that vitamin D could have prevented. This is the vitamin D folate hypothesis, and it's one of the most elegant explanations in all of evolutionary biology. In high UV environments like Africa, natural selection favors dark skin because it protects folate while still allowing enough UV through for vitamin D synthesis. In low UV environments, natural selection favors lighter skin because there's not enough UV to worry about folate destruction, but there is a desperate need to capture every available photon for vitamin D production. Skin color, in this model, represents an evolutionary balancing act between two opposing pressures, optimized for local UV conditions. The migrants who left Africa didn't understand any of this. They didn't know about vitamin D or folate or ultraviolet radiation. They just knew that at some point, probably after living in northern latitudes for thousands of years, some children were healthier than others. Some women had easier births. Some families were more successful at raising children to adulthood. And slowly, gradually, without anyone noticing, the populations were changing. But we need to be clear about the timeline here, because it's not what most people assume. The migration out of Africa started around 70,000 years ago. Various groups spread across Asia, into Europe, eventually reaching Australia and the Americas. Ancient DNA has revealed something surprising. The first modern humans in Europe, arriving around 45,000 years ago, still had dark skin. Genetic analysis of some of the oldest European fossils shows they carried alleles associated with dark pigmentation. They'd been living outside Africa for 25,000 years, and they were still dark. Even the famous Cheddar Man, a skeleton found in England and dated to around 10,000 years ago, genetic analysis suggests had dark skin and blue eyes. 10,000 years ago, Europe still had significant numbers of dark-skinned inhabitants. The shift to predominantly light skin in Europe may not have happened until as recently as 7,000 to 3,000 years ago. Some populations might have remained relatively dark, even into historical times. Why did it take so long? Several factors likely contributed. First, cultural adaptations may have buffered the selection pressure. Humans who reached northern latitudes didn't just endure the cold and darkness. They adapted culturally. They developed better clothing, built better shelters, learned to control fire more effectively. They probably also adjusted their diets. Fish, particularly fatty fish and fish liver, are rich in vitamin D. Populations living along coastlines or major rivers, subsisting on fish and seafood, would have gotten dietary vitamin D that compensated for what they couldn't produce in their skin. This would have reduced the selection pressure for light skin. Second, population size matters. But the human populations that first colonized Europe were probably small, maybe just a few thousand individuals spread across a vast territory. In small populations, genetic drift can overpower selection, and beneficial mutations can take a long time to become common. Third, the mutations themselves had to occur and survive. Evolution can't create new genes out of nothing. It has to work with random mutations that happen to arise. The specific genetic variants that produce light skin in Europeans, mutations in genes like SLC2-4A5 and SLC4-5A2, had to randomly occur in the population. Then those individuals had to survive, reproduce, and pass on those variants. Then those variants had to slowly increase in frequency, generation after generation, until they became common enough to change the population's overall appearance. This process takes time. Lots of time. Computer models suggest that even with strong selection pressure, a beneficial genetic variant might take hundreds of generations to sweep through a population and become the dominant form. That's thousands of years of gradual change, so gradual that no individual in their lifetime would notice it happening. But it did happen. Between roughly 10,000 and 3,000 years ago, something changed in Europe. The frequency of light skin alleles began increasing rapidly. Not just increasing, skyrocketing. By 3,000 years ago, most Europeans had light skin. The transformation from dark to light happened in just a few thousand years, which in evolutionary terms is incredibly fast. What changed? What suddenly accelerated the selection for light skin after 30,000 years of relative stasis? The answer appears to be agriculture. Around 10,000 years ago, farming spread into Europe from the Near East. Farming populations, bringing with them wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and a completely different way of life, moved into Europe and either replaced or mixed with the existing hunter-gatherer populations. And farming changed everything. Hunter-gatherers in Europe had been eating a diet rich in fish, game meat, and wild plants. This diet, particularly in coastal and riverine areas, provided substantial amounts of vitamin D. But farmers ate differently. They relied on cultivated grains, domesticated animals. Less seafood, their vitamin D intake dropped dramatically. Suddenly, the ability to synthesize vitamin D in the skin became critical again. Suddenly, having light skin that allowed maximum UV penetration wasn't just advantageous. It was essential. Populations with lighter skin were healthier, had stronger bones, had easier childbirths, raised more children to adulthood. The genes for light skin spread rapidly, driven by some of the strongest selection pressure that European populations had experienced since leaving Africa. Ancient DNA supports this timeline. Samples from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Europe show a mix of skin tones, but many still relatively dark. Samples from Neolithic farmers show an increase in light skin alleles. By the Bronze Age, light skin had become dominant. The transition happened during the period when agriculture was transforming Europe, exactly when you'd expect it to based on the vitamin D hypothesis. But Europe wasn't the only place where humans were adapting to low UV levels. Populations that migrated into northern and eastern Asia faced the same challenges. Low winter sunlight, long periods of darkness, vitamin D deficiency among dark-skinned individuals. And they solved the problem too. But here's what's fascinating. They did it differently. The genes that make Europeans light-skinned are not the same genes that make East Asians light-skinned. The two populations evolved lighter pigmentation independently through completely different genetic changes. This is convergent evolution, the same environmental pressure driving similar adaptations through different molecular pathways. In Europeans, the key genes are SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and variations in HERC2 and OCA2 that affect not just skin but also hair and eye color. In East Asians, different variants in genes like MFSD1, 2, and DDB1 played larger roles. The end result looks similar. Lighter skin adapted to low UV environments, but the genetic route to get there was different. Two populations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently solved the same problem. This tells us something profound. Light skin isn't a single evolutionary event. It's not something that happened once and then spread to everyone. It's something that has evolved multiple times, in multiple populations, whenever humans moved into low UV environments and stayed there long enough for selection to act. The journey out of Africa wasn't just a geographical expansion. It was an evolutionary laboratory, testing our species in every possible climate and environment. And our bodies changed in response, adapting to local conditions, optimizing for local selective pressures. Skin color is just the most visible of these adaptations, but it's a powerful reminder of how dynamic human evolution has been, even in the relatively recent past. Those first migrants leaving Africa 70,000 years ago had no idea what their journey would set in motion. No idea that moving north would literally change the color of their skin. They were just following the herds, seeking new territories, doing what humans do, moving, adapting, surviving. But their movement created the conditions for one of the most visible transformations in human evolution. The transformation from universal darkness to a rainbow of skin tones, each adapted to its local environment, each telling the story of human migration and adaptation written in melanin and genes. Let's talk about what vitamin D actually does, because understanding why it matters so much is key to understanding why skin color evolved the way it did. Vitamin D isn't some minor nutrient that makes a small difference at the margins. It's fundamental to human physiology in ways that directly impact evolutionary fitness. Start with bones. Vitamin D regulates calcium absorption in your intestines. Without adequate vitamin D, you can't absorb calcium efficiently, which means your bones can't mineralize properly. In children, this causes rickets, the disease we mentioned earlier. But it's worth understanding just how devastating rickets can be, because this is what natural selection was acting against. Imagine being a child in Northern Europe 10,000 years ago. You're born with dark skin, inherited from ancestors who migrated from Africa. Winter comes, and for months, the sun barely rises above the horizon. Your dark skin blocks most of what little UV reaches you. Your body can't produce vitamin D. The calcium from your food passes through your digestive system without being absorbed. Your bones start to soften. Your legs, bearing the weight of your growing body, begin to bow outward. Your ribcage deforms, creating a characteristic pigeon chest. Your wrists and ankles swell. Your skull doesn't harden properly. You're shorter than other children, weaker, more prone to infections because vitamin D also regulates immune function. If you're a girl, your pelvis develops abnormally, narrowing the birth canal. Now imagine reaching adulthood with this deformed pelvis. You become pregnant. Your baby develops normally, but when it's time for birth, the baby's head is too large to pass through your narrowed birth canal. In a world without cesarean sections, this is a death sentence. Both you and your baby die in childbirth. This isn't speculation. Skeletal evidence from archaeological sites shows that rickets was common in some northern populations. We find children's skeletons with the characteristic deformities. We find women's skeletons with pelvic abnormalities. And we can infer what this meant for reproductive success. Natural selection was operating with brutal efficiency, eliminating genes that caused vitamin D deficiency in low UV environments. But vitamin D does more than build bones. Research over the past few decades has revealed that vitamin D receptors exist in nearly every tissue type in the human body. This molecule that we thought was just about calcium absorption turns out to regulate hundreds of different genes. It affects immune function, helping your body fight off infections and regulate inflammation. It influences cell growth and differentiation, which matters for everything from wound healing to cancer prevention. It affects cardiovascular health, muscle function, even brain development. In pregnant women, vitamin D deficiency increases the risk of complications like preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and premature birth. In men, low vitamin D is associated with reduced testosterone levels and decreased fertility. In both sexes, deficiency increases susceptibility to infectious diseases, autoimmune conditions, and various cancers. From an evolutionary perspective, these effects matter because they directly impact reproductive success. A woman with vitamin D deficiency is less likely to conceive, more likely to have pregnancy complications, more likely to die in childbirth, or have babies who don't survive infancy. A man with vitamin D deficiency may have reduced fertility. Children with deficiency are more likely to die from infections or complications of rickets before reaching reproductive age. This is powerful selection pressure. Over thousands of years, in populations living in low UV environments, individuals who could produce vitamin D more efficiently, who had lighter skin that allowed more UV penetration, had more surviving children. Their genes became more common. The population gradually shifted toward lighter pigmentation, but here's the critical part of the vitamin D folate hypothesis. It's not just about vitamin D, it's about balance. Because while UV radiation is necessary for vitamin D production, too much UV is dangerous. It destroys folate, it damages DNA, it causes skin cancer. The optimal skin color for any given environment is the one that allows just enough UV through to produce adequate vitamin D, while still blocking enough to protect folate and prevent DNA damage. At the equator, where UV is intense year-round, the optimal solution is dark skin, blocks most UV, protects folate, but still lets enough through for vitamin D because the sun is so strong. At high latitudes, where UV is weak and seasonal, the optimal solution is light skin, allows maximum UV penetration for vitamin D synthesis, but doesn't need to worry as much about folate destruction because there's not that much UV to begin with. This creates what scientists call a cline, a gradient of skin color that correlates with latitude. The further from the equator, the lighter the skin. It's not a perfect correlation, because diet and culture and migration patterns all affect it, but the general trend is unmistakable. Populations that have lived near the equator for thousands of years have dark skin. Populations that have lived at high latitudes for thousands of years have light skin, and populations in between have intermediate tones. Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin demonstrated this correlation using satellite data. They took NASA measurements of surface UV radiation from thousands of locations around the globe. They compared this to anthropological records of indigenous skin colors in those same locations. The correlation was striking. You could predict a population's skin color just from knowing the UV levels where they lived. And you could predict UV levels from knowing skin color. The fit was so tight, it was almost scary. But proving correlation isn't the same as proving causation. Just because skin color correlates with UV levels doesn't necessarily mean UV caused the evolution of different skin colors. Could be coincidence. Could be some other factor that also correlates with latitude. To really prove the vitamin D folate hypothesis, you need to demonstrate the mechanism. You need to show that UV actually does destroy folate, and that this matters for reproduction. You need to show that dark skin actually does impair vitamin D production in low UV environments, and that this matters for health. The folate part has been demonstrated experimentally. Researchers exposed volunteers to simulated sunlight and measured their blood folate levels. In light-skinned individuals without sunscreen, folate levels dropped significantly after just an hour of exposure. The UV radiation was breaking down folate in the bloodstream. Dark-skinned individuals showed much smaller declines, their melanin protecting the folate. Other studies have shown that folate deficiency during pregnancy dramatically increases the risk of neural tube defects. The link between folate and reproductive health is well established. Pregnant women are routinely advised to take folate supplements to prevent birth defects. This is a vitamin that directly affects whether babies develop normally, which is exactly what you'd expect if natural selection had been acting to protect it. The vitamin D side has also been confirmed. Studies measuring vitamin D levels in different populations show that dark-skinned individuals living in high-latitude areas often have lower vitamin D levels than light-skinned individuals in the same environments. This is especially pronounced in winter and in populations that don't consume much vitamin D-rich food. The melanin is blocking UV, impairing vitamin D synthesis, exactly as the hypothesis predicts. Historical data supports this too. When populations migrated rapidly to new environments, before evolution had time to adjust their skin color, vitamin D-related problems appeared. African Americans in northern United States, for instance, have higher rates of vitamin D deficiency than European Americans in the same locations. South Asian immigrants to northern Europe experience similar issues. Their dark skin, adapted for high UV environments, struggles to produce adequate vitamin D in low UV settings. Conversely, light-skinned populations living in high UV environments show increased rates of skin cancer and, in some studies, folate deficiency. European colonists who moved to Australia and other sunny regions experienced epidemic levels of skin cancer. Their light skin, adapted for low UV environments, doesn't provide adequate protection against intense equatorial sun. These modern mismatches, where skin color doesn't match the environment, reveal what happens when the evolutionary balance is disrupted. They show us what natural selection was preventing over thousands of years of adaptation. Dark skin in low UV areas leads to vitamin D deficiency. Light skin in high UV areas leads to folate destruction and skin damage. The populations that thrived were those whose skin color matched their environment. But the hypothesis goes even deeper. Recent research has uncovered intricate connections between vitamin D, folate, and the genes that regulate skin pigmentation. Some of the same genes that affect melanin production also affect folate metabolism and vitamin D processing. This suggests that evolution wasn't just selecting for skin color itself, but for entire metabolic networks that balance these photosensitive vitamins. For example, variants in the MTHFR gene, which is critical for folate metabolism, show different distributions in populations with different skin colors. Variants that make folate metabolism more efficient are more common in light-skinned populations, possibly compensating for the greater UV exposure and folate breakdown that comes with less melanin protection. It's as if evolution was fine-tuning the entire system, not just the visible end product. This makes the vitamin D folate hypothesis more than just a simple story about skin color. It's a story about human physiology adapting as a coherent system to different UV environments. Skin color is the most visible change, the one we notice and categorize and build social meanings around. But underneath, at the level of metabolism and genetics, populations were evolving complementary adjustments in how they process these essential vitamins. The hypothesis also explains some puzzling variations that don't fit simple latitude-based predictions. The Inuit people of the Arctic, for instance, have relatively dark skin despite living at extreme northern latitudes where you'd expect very light skin. But the Inuit traditionally consumed enormous amounts of vitamin D from their diet, mainly from fish, seal, and whale blubber. With dietary vitamin D abundant, there was no selection pressure for lighter skin. The advantage of light skin, easier vitamin D synthesis, was irrelevant when vitamin D was coming from food. Similarly, some populations in tropical highlands have lighter skin than coastal populations at the same latitude. At high altitude, UV radiation is more intense because there's less atmosphere to filter it. This creates stronger selection for UV protection, hence darker skin. The reverse is true for populations living in heavily forested tropical areas, where tree cover blocks much of the sunlight. These populations sometimes have lighter skin than you'd expect from their latitude alone, because they're not getting as much UV exposure. The hypothesis explains why skin color is a terrible marker for race or ancestry. Because skin color is an environmental adaptation that can evolve relatively quickly. Populations can have similar skin colors without being closely related genetically, and closely related populations can have different skin colors if they've been living in different UV environments. The San people of southern Africa and the Aboriginal Australians, for instance, both have very dark skin, but genetically, they're about as distantly related as two human populations can be. They've been separated for over 60,000 years. Convergent evolution created similar skin colors from completely different genetic starting points. Conversely, Northern Europeans and some East Asian populations have light skin despite being genetically distinct, and achieving that light skin through different genetic mechanisms. The environmental pressure was the same, low UV requiring maximum vitamin D synthesis, but the genetic solutions were different. This is why modern genetics has completely undermined old racial categories based on skin color. Skin color tells you about UV adaptation. It tells you approximately how much sunlight your ancestors experienced over the past several thousand years. But it doesn't tell you much about overall genetic relatedness or ancestry. It's a single trait, controlled by a handful of genes, that has been shaped by local environmental conditions much more than by deep ancestral lineages. The vitamin D folate hypothesis isn't perfect. There are alternative explanations for some aspects of skin color evolution. Some researchers emphasize sexual selection, arguing that mate preferences for certain skin tones may have accelerated changes beyond what UV adaptation alone would predict. Others point to thermoregulation, suggesting that skin color affects heat absorption and loss in ways that matter for survival in different climates. These aren't necessarily competing hypotheses. They could all be true simultaneously. Evolution is rarely driven by a single factor. Multiple selective pressures can act together, reinforcing each other or creating complex trade-offs. Vitamin D and folate might be the primary drivers, but sexual selection and climate adaptation could modulate the details. What's clear is that skin color is adaptive. It evolved in response to environmental pressures. It's been shaped by natural selection operating on our ancestors over thousands of years. And the most important environmental pressure, the one with the most direct impact on reproductive success, appears to be ultraviolet radiation and its effects on these two essential vitamins. This is the dilemma that our ancestors faced as they spread across the globe. How to get enough UV for vitamin D without getting so much that folate is destroyed. How to protect against DNA damage without blocking the light needed for essential biochemistry. The answer was skin color. Calibrated to local conditions, evolving over hundreds of generations until it reached an optimal balance. And that balance was achieved through specific genetic changes, mutations in particular genes that we can now identify and study. Because the story of how humans became white isn't just about vitamin D and folate, it's about the actual molecular changes that made lighter skin possible. Here's something most people don't know. The genes that make European skin light are different from the genes that make East Asian skin light. And some of the genes that contribute to light skin in both populations actually originated in Africa millions of years before humans ever left the continent. The genetics of skin color is far more complex, far more ancient, and far more fascinating than anyone imagined until very recently. For most of human history, we could only guess at how skin color was inherited. We knew it was genetic, obviously. Children tend to have skin tones intermediate between their parents, but we didn't know which genes were involved, how many there were, or how they worked. Starting in the early 2000s, researchers began identifying the specific genes that control melanin production and skin pigmentation. What they found was stunning. Skin color isn't controlled by one gene or even a handful of genes. It's polygenic, influenced by hundreds of genetic variants scattered across dozens of different genes. Each variant has a small effect, pushing skin color slightly darker or slightly lighter. The cumulative effect of all these variants determines your final skin tone. But some genes have larger effects than others. There are a few key players. Genes where mutations have dramatic impacts on pigmentation. Understanding these genes is like understanding the major characters in a story. There are hundreds of minor characters too, but these are the ones driving the plot. Start with MC1R, the melanocortin-1 receptor gene. This gene codes for a protein that sits on the surface of melanocytes, the cells that produce melanin. When this receptor is activated by hormonal signals, it triggers a cascade of biochemical reactions that ramp up melanin production. Variants in MC1R that reduce the receptor's function result in less melanin, which means lighter skin, lighter hair, and often red or blonde hair color instead of brown or black. Here's what's remarkable about MC1R. In African populations, there's almost no variation in this gene. Everyone has the same functional version that produces maximum melanin. The gene has been under such intense purifying selection, meaning selection against any changes that mutations don't survive. Anyone born with a variant that reduced melanin production would have had lower fitness in the high UV African environment. Their folate would have been more vulnerable, their reproductive success would have been lower, the mutation would disappear. But outside of Africa, MC1R shows tremendous variation. European populations have multiple different variants, some associated with red hair and pale skin, others with various shades of brown hair and intermediate skin tones. Asian populations have their own distinct variants. The gene relaxed from the intense selection that kept it uniform in Africa, allowing variations to accumulate and spread. This pattern, uniform in Africa but variable elsewhere, is a signature of adaptation. It tells us that the ancestral human state was dark skin, maintained by strong selection, and that light skin evolved through relaxed selection and new mutations that arose after populations left Africa. But MC1R is just the beginning. Another crucial gene is SLC24A5, which codes for a protein involved in ion transport within melanosomes, the organelles inside melanocytes where melanin is produced. A single mutation in this gene, replacing one amino acid with another, has a dramatic effect. It reduces melanin production significantly, lightening skin tone considerably. This variant is almost universal in European populations, over 99% of Europeans carry it. This is one of the clearest examples of a selection sweep, a beneficial mutation spreading rapidly through a population until it becomes nearly fixed. The mutation probably arose sometime within the last 30,000 years, and it swept through ancestral European populations so quickly and so completely that it left a distinctive signature in the genome. Researchers can detect selection sweeps by looking at genetic variation around the selected gene. When a beneficial mutation spreads rapidly, it carries along neighboring DNA sequences in what's called genetic hitchhiking. This creates long stretches of DNA with very little variation because everyone inherited the same chunk of chromosome from the individual who first had the mutation. Around SLC24A5 in European genomes, you see exactly this pattern. Long stretches of low variation, indicating recent, rapid selection. But here's where it gets weird. The SLC24A5 light skin variant didn't originate in Europe. It originated in the Middle East or possibly East Africa, and it arrived in Europe through migration and gene flow. Populations that brought agriculture into Europe from Anatolia around 10,000 years ago carried this variant. When they mixed with existing European hunter-gatherers, the variant spread rapidly because it was highly advantageous in the low UV European environment. Even more surprising, this same variant is found in some East African populations today, particularly among groups like the Ethiopian and Somali peoples. It arrived there relatively recently, probably within the last few thousand years, brought by migrations from the Middle East. These populations have dark skin despite carrying a gene variant associated with light skin in Europeans. How is that possible? Because skin color is polygenic. SLC24A5 is just one piece of the puzzle. East Africans who carry the light variant at this gene also carry dark variants at many other pigmentation genes, and the cumulative effect keeps their skin dark. It's like having one ingredient for lighter skin but not the others needed for the full recipe. Another major gene is SLC45A2. This one also affects ion transport in melanosomes, and variants in this gene are associated with light skin, light hair, and light eye color in Europeans. Like SLC24A5, beneficial variants in this gene show evidence of recent strong selection in European populations. The light skin variants are common in Europe but rare elsewhere, suggesting they evolved specifically in response to European UV conditions. Then there's the OCA2 and HERC2 gene region. Variants here primarily affect eye color, with the famous variant that produces blue eyes located in an enhancer region near HERC2. But these genes also influence skin and hair color. The genetics here are complex, with multiple variants interacting in complicated ways. But the overall effect is to lighten pigmentation in European populations. Now here's where convergent evolution becomes really clear. East Asian populations have light skin, comparable to some European populations, but they achieved it through different genes. While SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 are critical for European light skin, they're not the main drivers in East Asia. Instead, variants in genes like MFSD12 and DDB1 play larger roles. MFSD12 is particularly interesting. Mutations in this gene reduce eumelanin production, the black-brown pigment, while potentially increasing pheomelanin, the red-yellow pigment. This creates a different pathway to lighter skin, one that's common in East Asian populations but rare in Europeans. It's a completely independent genetic solution to the same environmental problem. DDB1 is involved in DNA repair, but variants near this gene also affect skin pigmentation, apparently by regulating how melanocytes respond to UV damage. The specific variants that contribute to light skin in East Asians are different from those in Europeans. Another example of parallel evolution. This parallel evolution, light skin achieved through different genetic mechanisms, is powerful evidence that skin color really is an adaptation to UV levels. If light skin had evolved once and then spread to everyone through migration, we'd expect to see the same genetic variants everywhere. But we don't. We see different populations independently evolving lighter pigmentation through different genetic changes. The only explanation that makes sense is that these populations were all facing the same selective pressure, low UV requiring better vitamin D synthesis, and evolution found different genetic solutions in different places. But the story gets even more complicated when you look deeper into African genetic diversity, because it turns out that some variants associated with light skin in non-African populations actually originated in Africa long before humans left the continent. This was one of the most surprising discoveries from recent genomic studies of diverse African populations. Researchers led by Sarah Tishkoff studied pigmentation genetics across dozens of African ethnic groups. What they found was astonishing. Africa has more diversity in skin color than any other continent, and the genetic basis for this diversity is incredibly ancient. Some of the gene variants that affect pigmentation appear to be over 1 million years old, predating the emergence of modern humans. This means our Australopithecine ancestors, and possibly even earlier hominins, had genetic variation for a range of skin tones. The ancestral human condition wasn't uniformly dark. It was variable, with the potential for both lighter and darker pigmentation built into the ancient hominid gene pool. When humans evolved as a distinct species and spread across Africa, strong selection for dark skin in high UV equatorial regions made dark skin variants much more common. But the light skin variants didn't disappear entirely. They persisted at low frequencies, kept around by mutation and genetic drift, occasionally showing up in individuals but not spreading because they were disadvantageous. Then, when some humans migrated out of Africa into low UV environments, these ancient variants suddenly became useful. Selection favored them. They increased in frequency. Some of them spread to high frequencies in European and Asian populations. Variants that had been rare and disadvantageous in Africa became common and beneficial elsewhere. This explains a puzzling observation. The HERC2 and OCA2, variants associated with light skin and blue eyes in Europeans, are found at low frequencies in some African populations, particularly the San people of southern Africa. These aren't recent back migrations from Europe. These are ancient variants that have existed in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. They just became much more common in European populations after selection started favoring lighter pigmentation. The same pattern appears with other pigmentation genes. Variants associated with light skin in Europeans or Asians can often be found at low frequencies somewhere in Africa. They're not new mutations that arose outside Africa. They're old African variants that became selected for in new environments. This completely changes how we think about the evolution of light skin. It's not that humans left Africa and then evolved entirely new genes for light pigmentation. It's that they left Africa carrying a diverse genetic toolkit that included ancient variants for lighter skin. When they entered low UV environments, natural selection went to work sorting through this existing variation, increasing the frequency of variants that helped with vitamin D synthesis, decreasing the frequency of variants that maximized melanin production. Evolution worked with what was already there, repurposing ancient variation for new adaptive purposes. This is faster than waiting for new mutations to occur. It's one reason skin color could evolve relatively quickly once populations settled in significantly different UV environments. But the speed of evolution also depended on population dynamics. Genetic changes spread faster in growing populations and slower in small, isolated ones. They spread faster when selection is strong and slower when it's weak. The specific history of each population, its size, its migration patterns, its cultural practices, all affected how quickly skin color evolved. Population bottlenecks, events where population size crashes to very small numbers, can have huge effects. A bottleneck randomly eliminates genetic variation. Whichever variants happen to be present in the small surviving population become the foundation for all future generations. If the bottleneck by chance included more individuals with light skin variants, the post-bottleneck population would start out lighter. If it included more dark skin variants, the population would start out darker. The founder effect is similar. When a small group splits off from a larger population to colonize new territory, they carry only a subset of the parent population's genetic variation. The specific variants that happen to be in this founding group, which could be somewhat random, determine the starting genetic composition of the new population. These random processes interact with selection in complex ways. Sometimes they speed up evolution by randomly increasing the frequency of beneficial variants. Sometimes they slow it down by eliminating beneficial variants before selection has a chance to act. Sometimes they push populations in unexpected directions that have nothing to do with adaptation. This is why skin color evolution wasn't a simple, predictable process. It was messy, contingent on historical accidents, affected by random events as much as by adaptive pressures. The fact that we can still identify the major genetic changes and connect them to UV adaptation is remarkable. It means that despite all the noise, the signal of selection is clear enough to detect. Modern genomics has given us tools to see this selection in action. We can compare genomes from ancient individuals, people who lived thousands of years ago, to modern genomes. We can watch skin color genes changing over time. We can see selection sweeps happening in real time. Well, geological real time, which is thousands of years. One recent study analyzed over 300 ancient European genomes spanning 45,000 years. What they found was gradual change with periods of rapid shift. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had a mix of skin tones, many still quite dark. Neolithic farmers, arriving from Anatolia, brought lighter skin alleles. Bronze Age populations showed dramatic increases in light skin variants. By the Iron Age, most Europeans had light skin. This timeline matches perfectly with the archaeological and cultural changes happening in Europe. The spread of agriculture, changes in diet, population expansions and replacements, all correlating with shifts in skin color genes. The genetics and the archaeology are telling the same story. But perhaps the most important insight from all this genetic research is what it reveals about human unity and diversity. The genes that control skin color are a tiny fraction of the human genome. Out of over 20,000 genes, maybe a few dozen have significant effects on pigmentation, and even among those, the key differences between dark and light skin come down to a handful of variants in a handful of genes. Everything else, the vast majority of our genetic makeup, varies independently of skin color. Two light-skinned individuals from different populations might be more genetically different overall than a light-skinned individual and a dark-skinned individual from the same region. Skin color is literally skin deep, a superficial adaptation to local UV levels that tells us almost nothing about a person's overall genetic ancestry or relatedness. This is why geneticists get frustrated with racial categories based on skin color, because the genetics shows clearly that those categories are arbitrary and biologically meaningless. Skin color evolved recently, rapidly, independently, in multiple populations, in response to local environmental conditions. It's not a marker of deep ancestral lineages. It's not a window into someone's genetic essence. It's just melanin responding to UV, shaped by natural selection over a few thousand years. The genetic revolution has revealed the machinery behind skin color evolution. The specific genes, the specific mutations, the specific selection pressures. It's shown us that light skin isn't one thing, but many things, achieved through different genetic routes in different populations. It's shown us that the capacity for both dark and light skin has been in our gene pool for over 1 million years, and that evolution has been shuffling these variants around, responding to local conditions, creating the beautiful diversity of human skin tones we see today. This is the molecular story of how humans became white, or more accurately, how some humans became white, through specific genetic changes, in specific populations, in response to specific environmental pressures. But those changes were recent, superficial, and tell us far less about human diversity than we once thought. The real story is deeper, older, and written in the 20,000 genes that we all share regardless of skin color. If you walked through Europe 12,000 years ago, you'd encounter something that would shock modern sensibilities. Dark-skinned people. Not just a few. Most of them. The hunter-gatherers who lived across the European continent at the end of the last ice age had skin tones that would look distinctly African to modern eyes. Blue eyes were common, yes, but blue eyes set in dark-skinned faces. This revelation came from ancient DNA. In 2014, researchers extracted and sequenced DNA from a skeleton found in Cheddar Gorge in England. The skeleton, nicknamed Cheddar Man, was around 10,000 years old from the Mesolithic period. When they analyzed his genome and reconstructed his appearance based on genetic markers for pigmentation, the result was startling. Dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. He would have looked nothing like modern British people, nothing like what anyone expected for a prehistoric European. The findings generated controversy and skepticism. Some people simply didn't want to believe it. How could ancient Europeans have dark skin? Wasn't light skin the whole point of being European? But Cheddar Man wasn't an anomaly. As more ancient European genomes were sequenced, from sites across the continent spanning thousands of years, the pattern became undeniable. Early Europeans were dark. The pale skin we associate with Europe today is a recent innovation, maybe only a few thousand years old. A comprehensive study published in 2025 analyzed ancient DNA from 348 individuals, spanning 45,000 years of European history. The researchers used sophisticated methods to predict skin color from genetic markers, accounting for the fragmentary nature of ancient DNA. What they found was a gradual transformation, not a sudden shift. During the Paleolithic, the earliest period, most individuals had dark or intermediate skin. During the Mesolithic, roughly 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, the picture was mixed. Some individuals showed genetic markers for lighter skin, but many were still quite dark. It wasn't until the Neolithic, the period when agriculture spread into Europe, that light skin became common, and even then, the transformation was slow and geographically uneven. Full fixation of light skin alleles didn't happen until the Bronze and Iron Ages, roughly 3,000 to 2,000 years ago. This means that for most of European prehistory, Europeans were dark. Humans had been living in Europe for over 40,000 years, and for most of that time, they looked more like Africans than like modern Scandinavians. The pale complexion we think of as characteristically European is newer than the pyramids of Egypt. Why did it take so long? Why didn't light skin evolve immediately when humans entered the low UV environment of Northern Europe? The answer lies in diet, lifestyle, and the particular selective pressures that early European hunter-gatherers faced. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Europe lived largely off the land and sea. They hunted game, gathered wild plants, and importantly, consumed large amounts of fish and seafood. Fish, especially fatty fish like salmon and sardines, and fish organs like liver, are extremely rich in vitamin D. A traditional hunter-gatherer diet in coastal or riverine Europe would have provided ample vitamin D from food, reducing or even eliminating the need for cutaneous vitamin D synthesis. If you're getting plenty of vitamin D from your diet, there's no selection pressure for light skin. The advantage of light skin is that it allows more UV penetration for vitamin D synthesis. But if you don't need to synthesize vitamin D in your skin because you're eating it, that advantage disappears. Dark skin remains beneficial for whatever UV protection it provides, and light skin offers no compensating benefit. This dietary buffer explains why Mesolithic Europeans could remain dark-skinned despite living at high latitudes. They weren't suffering from vitamin D deficiency because their diet compensated. The selection pressure that would favor light skin simply wasn't operating, or was operating too weakly to drive rapid change. But then, around 10,000 years ago, everything changed. Agriculture arrived in Europe. Farming populations, originating in Anatolia and the Near East, began migrating into the continent, bringing with them cultivated wheat and barley, domesticated sheep and goats, and a fundamentally different way of life. These Neolithic farmers didn't rely on hunting and fishing. They relied on crops and livestock. Their vitamin D intake from diet plummeted. Suddenly, the ability to synthesize vitamin D in the skin became critical. Farmers living in Northern Europe, eating a grain-based diet with limited fish and game, would have been severely vitamin D deficient if they had dark skin. The selection pressure for light skin intensified dramatically, and the farmers arriving from Anatolia already carried genetic variants for lighter skin. The SLC2, 5 variant, one of the most important light skin alleles in Europeans, was already common in Near Eastern populations. When these farmers spread into Europe, they brought this variant with them. When they encountered and mixed with existing hunter-gatherer populations, the light skin alleles from the farmers began spreading rapidly through the combined population. This wasn't just gene flow, it was selection. The light skin variants weren't just passively spreading through population mixing. They were being actively selected for because they provided a survival advantage in the new agricultural context. Individuals with lighter skin had healthier children, fewer skeletal deformities from rickets, better reproductive success. The genes spread faster than they would from admixture alone. Ancient DNA shows this happening in real time. Genomes from early Neolithic farmers in Europe show intermediate frequencies of light skin alleles. Genomes from later periods show those frequencies increasing. By the Bronze Age, light skin variants were approaching fixation in many populations. Selection was driving rapid change, but the change wasn't uniform across Europe. It happened faster in some regions than others, creating a patchwork pattern that persisted for thousands of years. Northern Europe, with its lower UV levels and longer winters, saw faster selection for light skin. Southern Europe, with higher UV levels, maintained more diversity for longer. Even today, there's a north-south gradient in European skin color, lighter in Scandinavia and Britain. This gradient reflects both the strength of selection, stronger in the north where UV is weakest, and the history of population movements. Southern Europe had more gene flow from North Africa and the Near East, populations that maintained darker skin because they lived in higher UV environments. This gene flow continuously introduced dark skin alleles into Southern European populations, slowing the march toward universal light skin. The SLC24A5 story is particularly well documented. This gene has been under intense scrutiny because the light skin variant is so common in Europe and so clearly selected for. Researchers have traced its geographic distribution, its frequency in ancient populations, and its effects on skin color. What they've found is that the variant arose in the Near East, probably sometime between 15,000 and 30,000 years ago. It spread into Europe with Neolithic farmers and then swept rapidly to high frequency because it was so beneficial in the European environment. Today, over 99% of Europeans carry this variant. It's one of the most strongly selected loci in the entire European genome. The signature of selection is unmistakable. Long stretches of chromosome with almost no variation because the beneficial variant swept through so fast it carried along all the neighboring DNA. But SLC24A5 alone doesn't make someone pale. It's just one piece of the puzzle. Other genes, like SLC45A2, also underwent selection in Europe. Variants in this gene further reduce melanin production, lightening skin, hair, and eyes. The combination of beneficial variants at SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and several other pigmentation genes created the pale phenotype we see in Northern Europeans today. Eye color is part of this story too. The variant responsible for blue eyes, located near the HERC2 gene, shows its own signature of recent selection in Europe. Blue eyes appear in the archaeological record during the Mesolithic, before light skin became common. Some researchers think blue eyes might have been sexually selected, meaning people found blue eyes attractive and preferentially chose blue-eyed mates, causing the variant to spread even without a direct survival advantage. Hair color genetics are even more complex, involving dozens of genes with subtle interactions. Blonde and red hair appear in European populations during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. Some variants, like those in MC1R that cause red hair, clearly reduce melanin production overall and may have been selected for vitamin D synthesis. Others might have been neutral or even slightly disadvantageous, but spread through genetic drift or sexual selection. The cumulative effect of selection on all these genes was a transformation in European appearance. By the Iron Age, most Europeans looked recognizably European in the modern sense. Pale skin, diverse eye colors including blue and green, hair colors ranging from blonde to brown to black. But even this recent fixation has exceptions. Some European populations maintained darker pigmentation longer than others. Mediterranean populations, as mentioned, kept more genetic diversity. But there are also isolated pockets, like the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, who show their own unique patterns of pigmentation, genetics, reflecting their particular evolutionary history and possible admixture with Asian populations. The European story reveals just how contingent and recent these changes are. It's something that evolved recently, rapidly, in response to specific environmental and cultural changes. The shift from hunting to farming created the selection pressure. The arrival of populations already carrying some light skin alleles provided the genetic variation. Selection did the rest. driving those variants to high frequency in just a few thousand years. This timeline has profound implications. It means that for most of human history in Europe, people were dark-skinned. The cave painters of Lascaux, creating their magnificent art 30,000 years ago, probably had dark skin. The builders of Stonehenge, erecting those massive stones 5,000 years ago, probably had a mix of skin tones, some still quite dark. The Iceman, the famous mummy from the Alps who died 5,300 years ago, genetic analysis suggests he had relatively dark skin and brown eyes. The pale-skinned, blue-eyed stereotype of ancient Europeans is largely a fiction, a modern projection backward in time. The reality was more diverse, more dynamic, more recent than anyone imagined before ancient DNA gave us the tools to see the truth. And this European story is just one of several parallel stories happening across Eurasia. While Europeans were evolving pale skin through variants in SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, East Asian populations were evolving their own light skin through different genetic changes. While Europeans were being pushed toward lighter pigmentation by agricultural diets low in vitamin D, populations in Arctic regions were maintaining darker skin because their fish-heavy diets provided ample vitamin D regardless of skin color. There's an image most people have in their heads when they think about ancient Europeans: pale-skinned hunter-gatherers moving through misty forests, blonde hair and blue eyes, looking basically like modern Scandinavians, but wearing furs and carrying spears. This image is burned into our cultural consciousness through countless museum displays, textbook illustrations, and historical documentaries. It's also completely wrong. Ancient DNA has rewritten the story of European pigmentation, and the truth is far stranger and more recent than anyone imagined. The first modern humans in Europe were dark-skinned, not tan, not olive-toned, dark, and they stayed dark for tens of thousands of years. The transformation to the pale skin we associate with Europeans today happened shockingly recently, possibly as late as 5,000 to 3,000 years ago in some regions. We're not talking about the dawn of humanity. We're talking about a time when Stonehenge was already ancient, when the pyramids of Egypt were being built, when writing had already been invented in Mesopotamia. Let's start with the first Europeans. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, reached Europe around 45,000 years ago. They arrived from the east, moving through the Middle East and into southeastern Europe, then gradually spreading north and west. These weren't the first humans in Europe. Neanderthals had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. But modern humans were different, equipped with more sophisticated tools, more complex social structures, and eventually, they would replace the Neanderthals entirely. Ancient DNA extracted from some of the oldest modern human fossils in Europe reveals something surprising. These people had alleles associated with dark skin. They carried the ancestral African variants at key pigmentation genes. Genetically, their skin color would have been similar to modern Africans or Middle Easterners. Certainly not pale like modern Europeans. The most famous example is Cheddar Man, a skeleton found in Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, and dated to approximately 10,000 years ago. When scientists sequenced his genome in 2018, they discovered he had dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. This combination, dark skin with blue eyes, seems exotic to us now, but it appears to have been common in Mesolithic Europe. Blue eyes evolved relatively early in European populations, possibly as early as 14,000 years ago. The mutation that produces blue eyes, a variant in the HERC2 gene region, spread rapidly through European hunter-gatherers. But this happened independently of skin lightening. You could have dark skin and blue eyes, and apparently many people did. This tells us something important about how evolution works. Different traits evolve at different rates, depending on the strength of selection acting on them. Blue eyes may have spread through sexual selection, people preferring blue-eyed mates, or through genetic drift, random changes in gene frequency. But there wasn't strong natural selection either for or against blue eyes in terms of survival and reproduction. They were selectively neutral, or close to it. Skin color was different. There was strong selection for skin color, but it was working slowly in early European populations. Why slowly? Several reasons. First, the populations were small. When modern humans first reached Europe, there might have been only a few thousand individuals spread across the entire continent. In small populations, random genetic drift can overpower selection, and beneficial mutations take longer to spread. Second, diet probably buffered some of the vitamin D pressure. Mesolithic Europeans were hunter-gatherers who relied heavily on wild game, fish, and foraged plants. This diet, particularly the fish and game, provided substantial dietary vitamin D. When you're getting adequate vitamin D from food, the selective advantage of lighter skin is reduced. It's still advantageous, but not overwhelmingly so. Third, cultural adaptations helped. Better clothing, better shelters, controlled use of fire, all of these reduced the direct survival disadvantage of dark skin in northern climates. You could survive a northern European winter with dark skin if you had warm clothes and a good shelter, even if your vitamin D levels weren't optimal. So, for thousands of years, Mesolithic Europeans remained relatively dark-skinned. Not as dark as equatorial Africans, probably. There was some evolutionary lightening happening, but the process was gradual, slow, not creating dramatic differences. Then, around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, everything changed. Agriculture arrived in Europe, not independently invented, but brought by migrating populations from Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. They had domesticated wheat and barley, sheep and goats. They had a completely different way of life than the European hunter-gatherers. And critically, they had different genetics. Ancient DNA from Neolithic farmer skeletons shows that these migrants from Anatolia carried light skin alleles at higher frequencies than the European hunter-gatherers they encountered. Particularly, they had the derived variant of SLC. This variant was rare or absent in Mesolithic European hunter-gatherers, but common in the Anatolian farmers. When these farming populations spread into Europe, they didn't just bring agriculture, they brought their genes. In some regions, they largely replaced the existing hunter-gatherer populations. In others, there was significant mixing. But either way, the light skin alleles they carried began increasing in frequency across Europe. And the timing is critical. This happened right when diet was changing. Hunter-gatherers ate fish, game, wild plants, a diverse diet rich in vitamin D. Farmers ate cultivated grains, domesticated animals, less wild fish and game. Their vitamin D intake from food dropped dramatically. Suddenly, the ability to synthesize vitamin D in the skin became much more important. Suddenly, having light skin wasn't just mildly advantageous, it was critical for health. Natural selection responded. Over the next few thousand years, from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, light skin alleles swept through European populations. Not just SLC24A5, but also SLC45A2 and other genes contributing to light pigmentation. The frequency of these alleles went from rare to nearly universal in an evolutionary blink. A recent study analyzed DNA from over 300 ancient Europeans, spanning from 45,000 years ago to 1,700 years ago. They reconstructed probable skin color for each individual based on their genetics. The results were striking. In the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods, up to about 8,000 years ago, most individuals had dark or intermediate skin color. Only about 8% showed genetic signs of pale skin. In the Neolithic, as farming spread, the proportion of lighter-skinned individuals began to increase. By the Bronze Age, around 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, light skin was becoming common. By the Iron Age, 3,000 to 1,700 years ago, the majority of Europeans had light skin similar to modern Europeans. Think about what this means. As recently as 5,000 years ago, a significant portion of Europeans still had dark or intermediate skin. The stereotypical pale European appearance, the one we think of as ancient and primordial, is actually younger than the pyramids of Giza, younger than Stonehenge, younger than many ancient civilizations. The speed of this change is remarkable. From Neolithic to Iron Age is only about 7,000 years. That's roughly 350 generations. For such a dramatic change in a visible physical trait to happen that quickly requires strong selection. Natural selection was operating at high intensity, favoring light skin alleles so strongly that they went from rare to nearly universal in just a few thousand years. Computer models of population genetics suggest that for this to happen, individuals with light skin must have had a significant fitness advantage. Maybe they had 5 or 10% more surviving offspring than individuals with darker skin. That doesn't sound like much, but compounded over 300 generations, it's enough to completely transform a population. Why was selection so strong? The agricultural diet is part of it, but there may have been other factors too. Some researchers think population density mattered. As agriculture allowed populations to grow denser, living in larger settlements, infectious disease became more common. Vitamin D plays a critical role in immune function. Individuals with better vitamin D status, achieved through lighter skin, allowing better synthesis, might have been more resistant to infections. Another factor could be latitude. As populations expanded further north in Europe, into Scandinavia and the British Isles, they encountered even lower UV levels than in southern Europe. The selective pressure for light skin would have been even stronger at these high latitudes. This might explain why the lightest skin tones in the world are found in northern Europe and Scandinavia. But it's not just skin color that changed. Hair and eye color evolved too, creating the diversity we see in modern Europeans. Blonde hair, which is almost entirely restricted to European populations, appears to have evolved during this same period. Ancient DNA shows that blonde hair variants became common during the Bronze Age, right when light skin was also sweeping through the population. Red hair evolved too, through mutations in the MC1R gene. These mutations reduce eumelanin production dramatically, creating the distinctive red pigment and very pale skin that go along with red hair. Red hair variants show up in ancient DNA from various time periods, but they remained relatively rare, probably because the extremely pale skin that comes with red hair was disadvantageous even in northern Europe. Eye color diversified. The blue eye mutation had been around since the Mesolithic, but other eye colors like green and hazel evolved through different combinations of alleles at multiple genes. By the Iron Age, Europeans had the full spectrum of eye colors we see today, from blue to green to hazel to brown. This explosion of pigmentation diversity in Europe is unusual. Most human populations show less variation in these traits. In East Asia, for instance, almost everyone has dark hair and dark eyes, with skin color varying, but within a narrower range than in Europe. In Africa, there's great diversity in skin tone but less in hair and eye color. Europe's diversity in visible pigmentation traits is distinctive, and it all evolved very recently. Some researchers think sexual selection played a role. In populations where pigmentation wasn't under strong natural selection, where a range of skin, hair, and eye colors were all viable, mate preferences could drive the evolution of diversity. If people preferred novel or rare color combinations, selection could maintain multiple variants in the population, rather than driving everything to one optimum. This is speculative, but it would explain why Europe ended up with more visible diversity in these traits than other regions. Natural selection was pushing toward light skin, but within that general trend, sexual selection and genetic drift created the variation in hair and eye color we see today. But here's what's really important about the European story. It's recent, shockingly recent. The idea that pale skin is the ancient, original European trait, the one that's been there since humans first arrived, is completely wrong. Pale skin in Europe is younger than agriculture, younger than many archaeological sites we study, younger than recorded history in some parts of the world. This has profound implications for how we think about race and ethnicity. The physical features we associate with being European, pale skin, blonde or red hair, blue or green eyes, these aren't ancient adaptations that define some deep biological category. They're recent environmental adaptations that evolved quickly in response to specific selective pressures. And they evolved through gene flow and mixing. The populations that gave Europeans light skin, those Anatolian farmers, were themselves a mix of earlier populations with complex histories. The Yamnaya people, pastoralists from the steppes who migrated into Europe during the Bronze Age, brought additional genetic variation and mixed with existing populations. Europeans are the product of multiple waves of migration and mixing, with genes flowing in from the Middle East, the steppes, North Africa, and probably other regions we haven't fully identified yet. This mixing, this constant gene flow, is the norm for human populations. The idea of pure, isolated races evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years is fantasy. Real human populations have always mixed, migrated, exchanged genes, borrowed cultural practices. The genetic boundaries between populations are fuzzy and constantly shifting. European skin color is a perfect example. It evolved through the arrival of Anatolian farmers carrying alleles that probably evolved somewhere in the Middle East or even earlier in Africa. Then those alleles spread through populations that were already a mix of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and earlier migrants. Then Yamnaya pastoralists arrived and mixed in their genes. Then historical migrations brought more genetic variation. Europeans didn't evolve in isolation. They evolved through contact, mixing, and gene flow from multiple sources. The rapidity of the change also tells us something important. Skin color can evolve fast, really fast. Under the right selective pressures, a population's visible appearance can transform in just a few thousand years. This means skin color is a terrible marker for deep ancestry. It tells you about recent environmental adaptations, but very little about ancient lineages or genetic relatedness. Two populations could have similar skin color because they both adapted to similar UV environments, not because they're closely related. Conversely, two closely related populations could have very different skin colors if they've been living in different UV environments for a few thousand years. Skin color is superficial, literally and figuratively, a recent environmental adaptation that changes quickly and tells us almost nothing about the deeper genetic structure of human populations. The European story is a microcosm of the global story. Humans migrating to new environments, facing new selective pressures, evolving adaptive responses through natural selection, acting on existing genetic variation. Sometimes that variation is ancient, carried from Africa. Sometimes it's new, arising through recent mutations. Either way, evolution works with what's available, sculpting populations to fit local conditions. And the result is the diversity we see today, not fixed racial categories, but a continuous spectrum of variation, with populations blending into each other, sharing genes across fuzzy boundaries, all part of one species with one recent common origin in Africa. The pale skin of Europeans is just one chapter in this larger story. A recent chapter, a fascinating chapter, but not a fundamental or primordial chapter. It's evolution in action, natural selection responding to environmental change, written in genes we can now read and understand. When modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, they weren't alone. The continent was already occupied by another human species, one that had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years, perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe. The Neanderthals. And when these two human species met, something happened that would change both lineages forever. They interbred. We know this because if you're of non-African descent, roughly 2% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. That's not a metaphor or an approximation. That's actual Neanderthal DNA, inherited from ancestors who had children with Neanderthals somewhere between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago. And some of that Neanderthal DNA affects your skin color, your hair color, even how easily you tan. The story of Neanderthal pigmentation is complicated, partly because we only have DNA from a handful of individuals, and partly because Neanderthals themselves were probably quite variable. But what we do know is fascinating and challenges many assumptions about what these ancient humans looked like. For decades, artists and museums depicted Neanderthals with pale skin, light hair, sometimes even blue eyes. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia, regions with low UV radiation. If modern Europeans evolved light skin as an adaptation to these conditions, then surely Neanderthals, who'd been there far longer, would have evolved similar adaptations. The first genetic evidence seemed to support this. In 2007, researchers extracted DNA from Neanderthal fossils and sequenced the MC1R gene, the one with major effects on pigmentation. They found a variant that had never been seen in modern humans. When they tested this variant in cell cultures, they discovered it reduced MC1R function significantly. In modern humans, reduced MC1R function is associated with pale skin and red hair. The implication was clear. At least some Neanderthals had pale skin and possibly red hair. This fit the expectation perfectly. Neanderthals in Ice Age Europe, living under weak sunlight, would have faced the same vitamin D challenges as modern humans in the same region. Natural selection would have favored lighter skin. The MC1R variant was evidence that this had happened. But then the whole Neanderthal genome was sequenced, and the picture got more complicated. When researchers looked at the full suite of pigmentation genes in Neanderthal genomes, they found something unexpected. The SLC24A5 variant that's nearly universal in Europeans, not found in Neanderthals. The SLC45 are two variants associated with European light skin, also absent or present in different forms. This suggests that Neanderthals and modern Europeans evolved lighter skin independently through different genetic mechanisms. Convergent evolution again, the same environmental pressure, creating similar adaptations through different molecular pathways. Neanderthals had been in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd had plenty of time to evolve their own genetic solutions to the vitamin D problem, and those solutions were different from the ones modern humans would later evolve. But here's where it gets really interesting. When scientists started studying Neanderthal DNA introgression, the specific chunks of Neanderthal genome that survive in modern human populations, they found that some Neanderthal pigmentation genes had been positively selected in modern humans, meaning after interbreeding introduced these genes into the modern human gene pool, natural selection favored them. They increased in frequency because they provided some advantage. A large study, using data from over 112,000 people in the UK, Biobank found that Neanderthal alleles contribute to variation in skin tone, hair colour, and tanning ability in modern Europeans. But here's the twist. Some Neanderthal variants are associated with lighter skin, and others with darker skin. The Neanderthal contribution to modern pigmentation isn't uniform. It's complex, variable, adding to the overall diversity rather than pushing in a single direction. This suggests that Neanderthals themselves were variable in pigmentation. They probably had a range of skin tones, hair colours, eye colours, just like modern humans do. Some individuals may have had pale skin and light hair, others may have had darker features. The variation we see in Neanderthal DNA effects on modern pigmentation might reflect this ancient Neanderthal diversity. Think about what this means. Neanderthals occupied a huge geographic range, from Western Europe to Central Asia. They lived in different climates, different UV environments. Populations in southern regions near the Mediterranean would have experienced higher UV than populations in northern Europe. Just like modern humans, Neanderthals probably evolved regional adaptations, with populations in higher UV areas maintaining darker pigmentation and populations in lower UV areas evolving lighter skin. We can't directly test this because all the Neanderthal genomes we have come from relatively northern locations. We have good DNA from Neanderthals from Croatia, Germany, Russia, Siberia. We have fragmentary DNA from Neanderthals from Spain and Belgium. But we have essentially nothing from Neanderthals who lived in the Near East, in the Caucasus, in the southern parts of their range where UV levels were higher. This is a massive gap in our knowledge. The Neanderthals from these southern regions might have had darker skin, maintained by selection pressure to protect against higher UV. If we could sequence their genomes, we might find they carried different pigmentation alleles than northern Neanderthals, creating a cline similar to what we see in modern humans. But we're stuck inferring from indirect evidence. And one piece of indirect evidence is particularly intriguing. Modern humans interbred with Neanderthals somewhere in the Middle East, probably in the Levant region where both species overlapped. If the Neanderthals in that region had darker skin, adapted to Mediterranean UV levels, then the Neanderthal genes that entered the modern human gene pool might not have been light skin variants at all. This could explain why some Neanderthal pigmentation alleles in modern humans are associated with darker skin or increased tanning. These might be variants from Middle Eastern Neanderthals who needed UV protection, not from pale northern Neanderthals adapted to low UV. When these genes entered modern human populations and spread into Europe, they became part of the complex genetic architecture, controlling pigmentation, contributing to the diversity we see today. The interbreeding itself is worth pausing on. When modern humans left Africa and encountered Neanderthals, the two species had been separated for over 500,000 years. That's 10 times longer than the separation between modern humans and any existing human population. The children of these hybrid unions survived, reproduced, and passed on their mixed ancestry to future generations. This interbreeding happened multiple times in multiple locations. The initial mixing probably occurred around 50,000 to 45,000 years ago, as modern humans were moving through the Middle East into Europe and Asia. But there's evidence for later interbreeding events as well, as modern human populations expanded and encountered Neanderthal populations that had persisted in various refugia. Not all Neanderthal genes survived equally well in modern human genomes. Some regions of the Neanderthal genome are almost completely absent from modern humans, suggesting they were actively selected against. These are likely genes that caused hybrid incompatibilities, reducing fertility or survival in mixed individuals. But other Neanderthal genes not only survived but thrived, increasing to high frequencies because they provided adaptive advantages. Pigmentation genes are among these survivors, but they're not alone. Neanderthal alleles affecting immune function are common in modern humans, probably because Neanderthals had been in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years and had evolved resistance to local pathogens. When modern humans arrived, inheriting Neanderthal immune genes gave them a head start on dealing with diseases they'd never encountered before. Neanderthal genes affecting skin and hair texture also persist. The keratin genes that influence hair structure show Neanderthal contributions. This makes sense. Neanderthals had adapted to cold climates for hundreds of thousands of years. Their hair structure, possibly thicker or differently textured than African hair, might have provided better insulation. Modern humans moving into similar climates benefited from inheriting these adaptations. The contribution of Neanderthal genes to modern pigmentation is part of a larger pattern. Interbreeding with archaic humans provided modern populations with genetic variation that was immediately useful for adapting to non-African environments. Instead of waiting for new beneficial mutations to arise randomly, modern humans could borrow pre-adapted genes from species that had already solved the problems of living in Eurasia. This is called adaptive introgression, and it's increasingly recognized as an important mechanism in evolution. When species or populations hybridize, genes can flow from one to the other. If those genes are beneficial in the recipient population's environment, they'll be favored by natural selection and increase in frequency. The recipient population gets an adaptive boost without having to wait for evolution to reinvent the wheel. Neanderthal pigmentation genes are a perfect example. Modern humans arriving in Europe with dark African skin faced vitamin D challenges. Neanderthals had already solved this problem through their own evolutionary trajectory. Interbreeding allowed modern humans to acquire some of these solutions, speeding up their adaptation to European conditions. But this doesn't mean Neanderthals are the reason Europeans have light skin. The major genes responsible for European light skin, SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, don't come from Neanderthals. Europeans evolved light skin primarily through their own mutations and selection, not through Neanderthal inheritance. The Neanderthal contribution is real but secondary, modulating and adding variation to the overall pattern rather than creating it. It's also important to note that Neanderthal DNA is absent from sub-Saharan African populations. The interbreeding happened after modern humans left Africa, so only non-African populations carry Neanderthal ancestry. This creates a geographic pattern where Neanderthal genes, including pigmentation genes, are present in Eurasian and American populations, but not in African ones. This has sometimes been misinterpreted to suggest that Africans and non-Africans are fundamentally different or have different evolutionary histories. All modern humans, including Africans, descend from the same ancestral population in Africa. The Neanderthal admixture is a relatively minor addition that happened after a small group left Africa. It's a footnote to the main story, not a fundamental divide. Moreover, recent research has discovered that some African populations have their own archaic admixture. Ancient DNA studies suggest that some West African populations interbred with an unknown, archaic human species that diverged from modern humans even earlier than Neanderthals did. This ghost population left genetic traces in modern West Africans, including possibly some genes affecting pigmentation and adaptation to tropical diseases. So, interbreeding with archaic humans isn't unique to non-Africans. It's part of the complex, interconnected history of our species. Modern humans mixed with whatever archaic populations they encountered, borrowing useful genes and adding them to their genetic toolkit. The Neanderthal connection also tells us something important about how we should think about human evolution. It's not a tree with separate branches that never touch. It's a braided stream with lineages splitting and sometimes reconnecting, genes flowing between populations, adaptation happening through both new mutations and borrowed alleles. This makes classification into discrete categories difficult or meaningless. Are people with Neanderthal ancestry a different race from people without it? Obviously not. Are Europeans fundamentally different because some of their pigmentation genes have Neanderthal origins? The Neanderthal contribution is one part of a complex evolutionary history that includes ancient African variation, new mutations, selection, drift, and migration. What the Neanderthal connection does show is that human evolution is opportunistic. Evolution uses whatever variation is available, whether that's new mutations, ancient variation from the African gene pool, or genes borrowed from other human species through interbreeding. The result is modern human diversity, including skin color diversity, created through a combination of all these processes. The pale skin of some modern Europeans owes something to Neanderthals, something to ancient African variants, something to new mutations that arose in Europe, and something to migrations bringing genes from the Middle East and the steppes. It's a mosaic, a genetic patchwork created by tens of thousands of years of evolution, migration, and mixing. And we're still discovering new pieces of this mosaic. As more ancient genomes are sequenced, from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early modern humans, we keep finding unexpected connections. Genes flowing in unexpected directions at unexpected times, adaptations arising through unexpected mechanisms. The story keeps getting more complex and more fascinating. The Neanderthal contribution to modern skin color is just one thread in this larger tapestry. But it's an important thread because it reminds us that human evolution didn't happen in isolation. We evolved in a world populated by other human species, and we didn't just compete with them. We mixed with them, borrowed from them, incorporated their genetic solutions into our own lineage. We are, in a very real sense, a hybrid species, carrying within us the legacy of multiple ancient human lineages. And that legacy includes, among many other things, some of the genes that determine how much melanin your skin produces and what color you appear to the world. Genes that have a complex history spanning hundreds of thousands of years, multiple human species, multiple continents, and multiple independent evolutionary experiments in adapting to different UV environments. Here's something that surprises most people. Africa has more skin color diversity than any other continent on Earth. Not less, more. The range of skin tones among indigenous African populations is greater than the range you find anywhere else. From the very darkest brown, almost black, to relatively light brown that would be considered olive or tan in other contexts. And the genetics underlying this diversity is ancient, complex, and challenges almost everything people assume about skin color and race. When most people think about African skin color, they picture uniformity. Maybe they acknowledge some variation, lighter in North Africa, darker in West Africa. But the assumption is that Africa is the continent of dark skin, and that's basically the whole story. This assumption is completely wrong, and understanding why it's wrong is crucial to understanding human skin color evolution. Let's start with a basic fact. Modern humans evolved in Africa. Anatomically, modern Homo sapiens emerged somewhere in Africa, probably in East Africa, around 300,000 years ago. For the first 250,000 years of our species' existence, we lived only in Africa. All the genetic variation in the entire human species today originated in African populations during this period. This means African populations have had far more time to accumulate genetic diversity than any non-African population. When a small group left Africa around 70,000 years ago to colonize the rest of the world, they carried only a subset of African genetic variation. This founding population probably numbered just a few thousand individuals. They couldn't possibly carry all the genetic variants present in the much larger African population they left behind. This creates a pattern that geneticists call a serial founder effect. As humans spread across the globe, each migration involved a small group splitting off from a larger population, carrying only a fraction of that population's genetic diversity. Africa to Middle East, reduced diversity. Middle East to Europe, further reduction. Europe to Asia, more reduction. Each step away from Africa meant less and less genetic variation. The result is that African populations are the most genetically diverse human populations on Earth. They have more variation in most genes, including pigmentation genes, than any other continental population, and this variation includes variants for both dark and light skin. This was one of the most surprising discoveries from recent genomic studies. When Sarah Tishkoff's team studied pigmentation genetics across dozens of African ethnic groups, they found that the genetic diversity underlying skin color in Africa is enormous. They identified multiple genes with variants affecting pigmentation, and many of these variants are ancient, some over 1 million years old. Even more surprising, some of the variants associated with lighter skin in non-African populations are found in Africa. Not recent back migrations, but ancient African variation that's been there for hundreds of thousands of years. The genetic toolkit for both dark and light skin has existed in African populations since before modern humans even evolved. This completely changes how we think about skin color evolution. The old model was simple. All humans started dark in Africa. Some left and evolved light skin through new mutations. Dark and light skin represented two distinct evolutionary states, one ancestral, one derived. But the new data shows it's much more complex. The ancestral state was probably intermediate skin tone with variation in both directions. Strong selection in equatorial Africa pushed most populations toward very dark skin. Relaxed selection in some African populations and strong selection in non-African populations allowed or favored lighter skin variants. Look at the San people of southern Africa, the hunter-gatherers whose ancestors have lived in the region for tens of thousands of years. The San have relatively light skin compared to many other African populations. Not pale like Europeans, but noticeably lighter than West Africans or East Africans living closer to the equator. Genetic studies show they carry the derived allele of SLC24A5, the same variant that contributes to light skin in Europeans. How is this possible? One hypothesis was that this variant came to the San through recent gene flow from European colonists, but the frequency is too high, and the genetic patterns don't support recent introduction. Instead, this variant appears to be ancient in the San population, possibly arriving through gene flow from East African populations thousands of years ago. But here's the really interesting part. Recent research suggests that in the San, this variant was actually under positive selection, increasing in frequency because it provided an advantage. Why would a light skin variant be advantageous in southern Africa? Because the San live at higher latitudes than equatorial populations, and they have traditionally lived in relatively open environments, with high sun exposure but lower UV radiation than at the equator. The selection for lighter skin in the San happened independently of the selection for lighter skin in Europeans. Same gene, same variant, but selected in different populations at different times for similar reasons. This is parallel evolution at the level of specific genetic variants, not just at the level of overall phenotype. Other African populations show different patterns. The Hadza of Tanzania, another hunter-gatherer group, have very dark skin. They live near the equator and have been under strong selection to maintain maximum UV protection. East African populations like Ethiopians and Somalis show intermediate skin tones, partly due to gene flow from the Middle East bringing lighter skin variants, partly due to their own evolutionary history. West African populations, particularly those from the Sahel region and the tropical forests, tend to have very dark skin. These populations have been living in high UV environments with strong selection for folate protection. But even within West Africa, there's variation. Coastal populations versus inland populations, forest dwellers versus savanna dwellers, all showing subtle differences in skin tone and pigmentation genetics. The key genes contributing to this African diversity are fascinating. MFSD12, a gene we mentioned earlier in the context of East Asian pigmentation, also shows important variation in African populations. But in Africa, the variants associated with darker skin are under strong positive selection in equatorial regions. Individuals carrying dark skin variants at this gene have higher eumelanin production, providing better UV protection. DDB1 is another gene showing interesting patterns in Africa. Variants near this gene affect how skin responds to UV exposure, influencing both constitutive pigmentation and the ability to tan. Different African populations have different frequencies of these variants, reflecting local adaptations to specific UV environments. Even MC1R, the gene that shows almost no variation in most African populations, has some interesting exceptions. A few populations, particularly in northeastern Africa, show slightly higher variation at this locus, possibly due to gene flow from non-African populations or relaxed selection in specific environments. This African diversity has profound implications. It means that African skin color isn't a single thing. There's no typical African pigmentation. The variation within Africa is as great as the variation between Africa and other continents. Trying to categorize someone as African based on skin color is meaningless because Africans themselves span nearly the entire human range of skin tones. It also means that the genes for light skin aren't European or Asian. They're human genes, variants that existed in our species long before anyone left Africa. What happened outside Africa wasn't the evolution of entirely new genes. It was selection acting on ancient variation, increasing the frequency of light skin variants that had been rare in Africa. This is why geneticists can look at someone's genome and tell roughly where their ancestors came from, but skin color alone tells them almost nothing. An African person with relatively light skin might be from Southern Africa, or East Africa, or North Africa. Their skin color doesn't narrow it down. Similarly, a non-African person with dark skin could have ancestry from South Asia, Melanesia, Australia, or various other regions. The disconnect between skin color and ancestry is even more pronounced when you consider recent migration and mixing. African Americans, for instance, have on average about 20% European ancestry due to mixing during and after the slavery era. This European ancestry includes some light skin alleles, but African Americans generally have dark skin because the African dark skin alleles at other genes dominate. Skin color is polygenic, and you need light skin variants at many genes to produce pale skin. Having them at just a few genes isn't enough. The same is true in reverse. Some Europeans have small amounts of African ancestry from historical mixing around the Mediterranean. This African ancestry includes some dark skin alleles, but these individuals still have light skin because they carry light skin variants at most of the key genes. A few dark skin alleles in a mostly light skin genetic background don't change the overall appearance much. This is why ancestry testing companies can tell you your genetic ancestry, but can't predict your skin color with precision. Skin color depends on which specific alleles you inherited at dozens of different genes. Two siblings with the same parents can inherit different combinations of alleles and end up with noticeably different skin tones. Over generations, the combinations get shuffled and reshuffled, creating variation even within families. But let's return to Africa, because there's another layer of diversity we need to understand, not just diversity between populations, but diversity in how different African populations evolved their pigmentation. Some populations show evidence of recent strong selection for dark skin. Others show evidence of ancient selection that's been stable for hundreds of thousands of years. Still, others show signs of recent lightening through gene flow or adaptation to new environments. The Bantu expansion is a good example. Starting around 3,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking agricultural populations began expanding from West Africa across Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. These populations carried with them specific pigmentation alleles, and as they mixed with indigenous hunter-gatherer populations, the genetic landscape of African pigmentation changed. In some regions, the Bantu and indigenous populations mixed extensively, creating new combinations of pigmentation genes. In other regions, the populations remained more separate, maintaining distinct genetic profiles. The result is a patchwork of pigmentation genetics across Africa, reflecting this complex history of migration and mixing. Modern urbanization and globalization are creating new patterns. As African populations migrate internally and internationally, new combinations of pigmentation genes are forming. Cities like Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, these are melting pots where people from different African ethnic groups, each with their own pigmentation, genetics, are mixing and creating new variation. This ongoing evolution is important to recognize. Skin color isn't a fixed trait that evolved once and then stopped changing. It's continuously evolving in response to new environmental pressures, new diets, new UV exposures, and new patterns of mating and migration. African populations are evolving, just like all human populations, adapting to modern conditions while carrying the legacy of their evolutionary past. One particularly interesting case is the spread of the SLC24A5 light skin variant into East Africa. This variant, which is nearly universal in Europe, appears in some East African populations at frequencies of 30 to 50%. It arrived relatively recently, probably within the last 3,000 years, through migration from the Middle East. You might expect this to have lightened East African skin color dramatically, but it didn't, at least not uniformly, because East Africans also carry dark skin variants at other genes, and the combination produces intermediate skin tones. The SLC24A5 variant contributes to the overall lighter skin tone of East Africans compared to West Africans, but it doesn't make them pale. This is a perfect example of how polygenic traits work. No single gene determines your skin color. It's the combined effect of variants at many genes. Different populations can have different combinations of alleles, producing similar skin colors through different genetic routes. Or they can have some alleles in common but different alleles at other genes, producing different skin colors despite sharing some genetic variants. Understanding this complexity is crucial for medicine. Vitamin D deficiency, skin cancer risk, other health conditions related to skin pigmentation. These don't map neatly onto racial categories. An East African with intermediate skin tone might have different health risks than a West African with dark skin, even though both would be categorized as African or black in many social contexts. Similarly, a Southern European with olive skin and a Northern European with pale skin have different UV sensitivities and different vitamin D production capacities, even though both are European or white in common parlance. Medical recommendations need to account for actual pigmentation and UV exposure, not crude racial categories. The diversity we don't see when we look at Africa, the genetic complexity underlying what appears to be simply dark skin. This is a microcosm of human genetic diversity overall. Beneath visible traits are layers of variation, ancient and recent, shared and unique, constantly being shuffled and resorted by the processes of evolution. Africa isn't just the origin of humanity. It's the keeper of humanity's deepest genetic diversity. The continent holds genetic variation that's been accumulating for hundreds of thousands of years, variation that includes the potential for traits we see in all modern populations. When we study African genetics, we're not studying one population among many. We're studying the source, the wellspring from which all human genetic diversity ultimately flows. And that diversity includes skin color. The full range of human skin tones, from the darkest to the lightest, is represented by genes that originated and persisted in Africa. When humans spread across the world, they didn't create new skin colors from scratch. They sorted the variation they carried from Africa, selected for different variants in different environments, and created the geographic distribution of skin tones we see today. This is why the question, how did humans become white, is really a question about selection acting on ancient variation, not the creation of something new, but the reorganization of something old. The capacity for both dark and light skin has been in our species since before we were fully modern. What changed as we spread across the globe was which variants were favored, which increased in frequency, which became the norm in different populations. The vitamin D folate hypothesis is powerful. It explains so much about the global distribution of skin color, the correlation with UV radiation, the selection pressures that drove light skin evolution in some populations and maintained dark skin in others. But if you're paying attention, you've probably noticed that it doesn't explain everything. There are exceptions, anomalies, patterns that don't quite fit the simple UV adaptation model, and that's because skin color evolution is more complex than any single hypothesis can capture. Let's start with one of the most obvious exceptions. The Inuit people of the Arctic, along with other indigenous populations of far northern regions, have relatively dark skin. Not as dark as equatorial Africans, but definitely darker than you'd expect for people living at latitudes where the sun barely rises above the horizon for months at a time. By the vitamin D hypothesis, they should be pale, possibly the palest people on Earth. But they're not. The traditional explanation is diet. The Inuit historically consumed enormous amounts of vitamin D from their food. Fish, seal, whale, these marine mammals have blubber and organs incredibly rich in vitamin D. An Inuit person eating a traditional diet might consume 10 times more vitamin D than a modern American taking supplements. With that much dietary vitamin D, there's no selection pressure for light skin to improve UV-based synthesis. The vitamin D problem is already solved through diet. This makes sense and is probably part of the answer. But it's worth asking why the Inuit have dark skin rather than just intermediate skin. Why maintain pigmentation that's darker than necessary if there's no UV exposure to worry about? Some researchers think the answer might be snow blindness and UV reflection. Snow reflects up to 90% of UV radiation. In Arctic conditions, you're not just getting UV from above, you're getting it reflected from below, from all around. This reflected UV can still damage skin and eyes. Dark skin might provide protection against this unusual UV exposure pattern. Another factor could be relatively recent arrival. The ancestors of the Inuit reached the Arctic only about 5,000 years ago. That's not much time for evolution to act, especially if dietary vitamin D was adequate from the start. They might simply be darker because they haven't been there long enough to evolve extremely pale skin, and there hasn't been strong enough selection to drive rapid change. But the Inuit are just one example of populations that don't quite fit the simple UV model. Let's talk about another factor that might influence skin color evolution: thermoregulation. The regulation of body temperature. Skin color affects how much solar radiation your body absorbs. Dark skin absorbs more radiation across the visible and infrared spectrum. Light skin reflects more. This has implications for heating and cooling in different climates. But remember, dark skin also blocks more UV from penetrating to deeper layers, which means less heat generation from UV damage and inflammatory responses. The relationship between skin color and thermoregulation is complex and not fully understood. Some researchers have proposed that in cold climates, light skin might have been advantageous because it allowed more radiant heat absorption when UV levels were low. During brief summer periods at high latitudes, maximizing heat absorption from weak sunlight might improve survival. Dark skin, by reflecting more radiation, might leave you colder. This is speculative and controversial. The effects are probably small compared to clothing, shelter, and metabolic heat generation, but it might have provided a small additional push toward light skin in cold climates, reinforcing the vitamin D selection. Then there's the metabolic conservation hypothesis. This suggests that in cold, dark environments where food was scarce during long winters, reducing melanin production might have been advantageous simply because it saved metabolic energy. Melanin synthesis requires amino acids, energy, and cellular resources. If melanin isn't providing much benefit because there's minimal UV to protect against, why waste resources making it? This hypothesis is even more speculative. The amount of energy saved by reducing melanin production is probably tiny compared to overall metabolic needs, but evolution operates on tiny advantages accumulated over many generations. If light-skinned individuals had slightly more energy available for other functions like immune response or reproduction, that might have been enough to shift allele frequencies over thousands of years. Sexual selection is another factor that might have influenced skin color evolution independently of UV adaptation. If people in a population preferentially choose mates with certain features, those features will become more common even if they don't improve survival. There's some evidence that sexual selection might have influenced pigmentation diversity, particularly in features like hair and eye color. The explosion of variation in European hair and eye color, far beyond what UV adaptation alone would predict, might be partly due to sexual selection favoring novelty or diversity. If rare color variants were considered attractive, selection could maintain multiple variants in the population rather than driving everything toward a single optimum. Skin color itself might have been subject to sexual selection in some populations. If lighter skin was considered attractive for cultural or aesthetic reasons, independent of any health benefits, preference for light-skinned mates could accelerate the evolution of light skin beyond what vitamin D selection alone would produce. Similarly, preferences for darker skin in some populations might have maintained pigmentation darker than UV protection alone required. This is difficult to prove because we can't go back in time and survey ancient populations about their mate preferences. But in modern populations, skin tone preferences do exist and vary across cultures. Some cultures historically valued lighter skin as a marker of status, perhaps because it indicated not working outdoors. Others valued darker skin as a sign of health and vitality. These preferences could have evolutionary roots or could be entirely cultural constructs. Disentangling biological and cultural factors is nearly impossible. Another complicating factor is population history and demographic events. Evolution doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in real populations with complex histories involving migration, bottlenecks, founder effects, and gene flow. These demographic factors can overwhelm natural selection, driving trait frequencies in directions that have nothing to do with adaptation. Population bottlenecks, where population size crashes to very small numbers, can randomly eliminate genetic variation. If a bottleneck happens to remove most dark skin alleles by chance, the post-bottleneck population will be lighter skinned, even if dark skin would have been advantageous. Conversely, a bottleneck that eliminates light skin alleles will leave the population darker. Founder effects work similarly. When a small group splits off to colonize new territory, they carry only a subset of the parent population's genetic variation. The specific alleles they carry, which could be somewhat random, determine the starting point for evolution in the new population. If the founders happen to carry more light skin alleles, the new population starts out lighter. If they carry more dark skin alleles, it starts darker. Over time, natural selection can push populations toward adaptive optima, but the path taken depends on the starting point, and the starting point depends on demographic history. Two populations in similar environments might evolve somewhat different skin colors if they started from different founding populations with different initial allele frequencies. Gene flow between populations also complicates the picture. When populations mix, they exchange genes. If a light-skinned population mixes with a dark-skinned population, the resulting population will have intermediate skin color and a mix of alleles. This mixing can introduce genetic variation that natural selection can then act on, but it also creates patterns that don't reflect local adaptation. East African populations are a good example. They show intermediate skin tones partly due to local adaptation, but also partly due to gene flow from Middle Eastern populations. The SLC24A5 light skin variant that's common in East Africa arrived through migration, not through local evolution. Its frequency in East Africa reflects both the migration history and subsequent selection acting on the introduced variation. Cultural practices can also modulate selection on skin color. Clothing, shelter, and diet all affect the relationship between skin color and fitness. Populations with sophisticated clothing can survive at high latitudes with darker skin than they could naked. Populations with diets rich in vitamin D don't face the same selection for light skin as populations relying primarily on UV synthesis. As humans developed more complex cultural adaptations, the direct selection on skin color probably weakened. This might explain why skin color evolution slowed or stopped in some populations, even though they continued to live in environments where different skin colors would seem optimal. Culture buffered the selection pressure, allowing more variation to persist. Parasite pressure is another factor that's been proposed but remains poorly understood. Some researchers suggest that skin pigmentation might affect susceptibility to certain parasites or pathogens. If melanin, or the biochemical pathways that produce it, have immune functions beyond UV protection, then pathogen environments might influence skin color evolution independently of UV. There's some evidence for this. Melanin is involved in immune responses. The same cellular machinery that produces melanin also participates in inflammatory responses and wound healing. Genetic variants affecting melanin production might have pleiotropic effects, influencing multiple traits simultaneously. Selection for immune function could inadvertently select for or against certain pigmentation variants. But this is highly speculative. The effects are probably small and difficult to separate from other factors. More research is needed to determine whether pathogen pressure has meaningfully influenced skin color evolution in human populations. What all these alternative and complementary hypotheses tell us is that skin color evolution is multifactorial. Vitamin D and folate are probably the primary drivers, the main selective pressures that created the global pattern of darker skin near the equator and lighter skin at high latitudes. But layered on top of this are effects from thermoregulation, sexual selection, demographic history, cultural practices, and possibly other factors we haven't identified yet. This complexity makes sense when you think about how evolution actually works. Natural selection isn't a single force pushing in one direction. It's multiple forces, some weak and some strong, some consistent and some variable, all acting simultaneously on populations with complex histories. The outcome is the product of all these forces combined, not any single one in isolation. For skin color specifically, this means we shouldn't expect perfect correlation between UV levels and pigmentation. We should expect variation, exceptions, populations that are lighter or darker than the UV model alone would predict. And we should expect different populations to achieve similar skin colors through different combinations of selective pressures and demographic events. This doesn't invalidate the vitamin D folate hypothesis. That remains the best explanation for the overall global pattern, but it contextualizes it, showing that while UV adaptation is primary, it's not the whole story. Skin color is adaptive, yes, but it's adapted to a complex environment that includes not just UV radiation, but also temperature, diet, pathogens, cultural practices, and the contingent history of each population. Understanding this complexity is important for several reasons. Scientifically, it reminds us that simple explanations, while appealing, rarely capture the full truth. Evolution is messy, and human evolution especially so because of our complex behaviors and cultures. We need to resist the temptation to reduce everything to a single, elegant hypothesis, and instead embrace the messiness of multiple interacting factors. Medically, this complexity means we can't make simplistic assumptions about health risks based on skin color alone. Vitamin D deficiency risk depends on skin color, yes, but also on diet, sun exposure, latitude, season, clothing, and individual genetic variation in vitamin D metabolism. Skin cancer risk similarly depends on multiple factors beyond pigmentation. Socially, this complexity undermines racial categories even further. If skin color is the product of multiple factors varying independently, then skin color doesn't cluster naturally into discrete groups. It varies continuously, with populations blending into each other and with similar skin colors arising through different evolutionary paths in different populations. There's no natural way to divide humans into racial groups based on skin color, because skin color itself doesn't divide naturally. The story of how humans became white isn't just about vitamin D. It's about vitamin D and folate and temperature and sexual selection and population history and culture, and possibly factors we haven't even identified. It's a story of evolution operating in the real world, where multiple pressures shape traits in complex ways, where history matters as much as adaptation, and where the outcomes are never as simple as we'd like them to be. But complexity doesn't mean chaos. Patterns still emerge. The global correlation between UV and skin color is real and strong. The selection for dark skin in high UV environments and light skin in low UV environments is well supported. The vitamin D folate hypothesis explains most of the variation most of the time. It's just that most isn't all, and understanding the exceptions helps us understand the rule better. Evolution is usually described as a slow process, glacially slow, changes accumulating over millions of years, invisible within any human lifetime, only apparent when you look at fossils separated by vast stretches of time. And for many traits, this is true. But skin color is different. Skin color can evolve fast, shockingly fast. Under the right conditions, a population's appearance can transform in just a few thousand years, maybe even faster. We've already touched on this with the European story. The shift from dark to light skin in Europe happened in roughly 7,000 years, maybe less. That's about 350 generations. From an evolutionary perspective, that's nothing, a blink. The speed of this change tells us something important about how evolution works and what it means for understanding human diversity. Let's start with the basic math of selection. Natural selection works by changing allele frequencies in populations. An allele that improves survival or reproduction becomes more common over time. An allele that reduces fitness becomes less common. The speed at which this happens depends on several factors. How strong is the selection? How large is the population? How much variation exists? For skin color in populations moving to high latitudes, selection was probably quite strong. Vitamin D deficiency isn't just mildly disadvantageous. It causes rickets, pregnancy complications, reduced fertility, immune dysfunction. In populations relying on UV synthesis for vitamin D and not getting much from diet, individuals with dark skin might have had 10 or 20% lower reproductive success than individuals with lighter skin. That's strong selection. For comparison, most traits evolve under much weaker selection, with fitness differences of 1 or 2%. When selection is 10% or stronger, evolution can happen rapidly. Computer models show that under selection of this strength, a beneficial allele starting at low frequency can sweep to high frequency in just a few hundred generations. But there's a catch. For rapid evolution to happen, the beneficial variation needs to already exist in the population. If you're waiting for new mutations to arise, evolution slows down dramatically. Mutations are random and rare. The probability of the right mutation occurring in any given generation is tiny. You might wait thousands or tens of thousands of generations for the specific mutation you need. This is where the ancient African variation becomes crucial. The light skin alleles that swept through European and Asian populations didn't need to evolve from scratch. They already existed at low frequencies, carried from Africa, or arising from standing variation in early migrant populations. When these populations moved to low UV environments, selection didn't have to wait for new mutations. It could immediately start acting on the variation that was already there. This is called selection on standing variation, and it's much faster than waiting for new mutations. The light skin alleles were already in the population, maybe at frequencies of 1 or 2%. When selection started favoring them, they increased rapidly. Within a few hundred generations, they could go from rare to common. Within a few hundred more, they could become nearly universal. The genetic signatures of these rapid sweeps are visible in modern genomes. Around genes like SLC24A5 in Europeans, we see long stretches of DNA with very little variation. This happens because when an allele sweeps rapidly through a population, it carries along neighboring DNA sequences. Everyone who has the beneficial allele inherited it from a recent common ancestor, so they also share the DNA around it. This creates a distinctive pattern that geneticists can detect and use to identify which genes have been under recent strong selection. These signatures tell us not just that selection happened, but roughly when and how strong it was. For European light-skin genes, the signatures suggest selection started ramping up around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago and continued strongly until about 5,000 to 3,000 years ago. This matches the archaeological and ancient DNA evidence perfectly. The Neolithic agricultural transition, the period when selection for light skin should have been strongest, leaves a clear genetic signature. But skin color isn't controlled by a single gene. It's polygenic, influenced by dozens or hundreds of genetic variants. For polygenic traits, evolution can happen even faster than for single gene traits, because selection can act on many variants simultaneously. Each generation, individuals with more light skin alleles have higher fitness. Over time, the frequency of all these alleles increases together, and the population's skin color shifts smoothly and rapidly. This polygenic architecture explains why skin color varies continuously rather than in discrete categories. You don't have dark skin genes and light skin genes as separate packages. You have dozens of genes, each with variants that push skin color slightly darker or lighter. Different individuals have different combinations of these variants, creating a spectrum of skin tones rather than distinct categories. It also explains why skin color can evolve quickly. You don't need a single dramatic mutation that transforms dark skin to light. You just need gradual shifts in the frequencies of many small effect variants. Each generation is slightly lighter than the last. Multiply this over hundreds of generations, and you get dramatic change. The speed of skin color evolution also depends on population, size, and structure. Large populations evolve faster than small ones because there are more individuals for selection to act on, and more copies of beneficial alleles appearing each generation through mutation or existing in the population. Small populations evolve slower and are more subject to random drift. Overwhelming selection. This might explain some of the variation in how quickly different populations evolved light skin. European populations during the Neolithic were growing rapidly as agriculture spread. Large population sizes meant selection could act efficiently. But some northern populations that remained hunter-gatherers may have had smaller population sizes, slowing their evolution toward lighter skin. Population structure also matters. If a species is divided into many small, isolated populations with limited gene flow between them, evolution can proceed differently in each population. But if there's substantial gene flow, adaptive alleles can spread quickly between populations through migration, accelerating overall evolution. Humans have high gene flow. We've never been divided into truly isolated populations for long periods. Even populations separated by thousands of miles maintain some genetic contact through occasional migration. This means beneficial alleles arising in one population could spread to others, speeding up adaptation across the species. The SLC24, a 5 light-skin variant, is a perfect example. It probably arose once, somewhere in the Middle East or Eastern Mediterranean, and then spread through both migration and selection. European populations acquired it through gene flow from Anatolian farmers. Once a beneficial allele exists anywhere in a species with gene flow, it can potentially spread everywhere it's advantageous. This helps explain the remarkable similarity in skin color between some unrelated populations. Northern Europeans and Northern East Asians have similar light skin tones despite being genetically distinct and achieving light skin through different genes. The similar skin color is convergent evolution, both populations independently adapting to similar low UV environments. But the speed at which this happened was facilitated by both populations having access to genetic variation through their large population sizes and migration networks. Recent research has also revealed that skin color evolution didn't stop in the distant past. It's ongoing. Populations are still evolving, still adapting to changing environments and circumstances. The spread of agriculture across Africa over the past few thousand years has created new selection pressures. Urbanization and modern lifestyles are changing UV exposure patterns. Migration is creating new population mixtures with new genetic combinations. Some of this recent evolution is visible in genetic data. The rapid spread of the SLC24A5 light-skin variant through East African populations over the past 2,000 years is one example. This variant arrived through migration, but then increased in frequency faster than gene flow alone would predict, suggesting it was positively selected in the new environment. In southern African populations like the San, the same variant shows evidence of very recent selection, possibly within the last 2,000 years. This is evolution happening in historical time, not deep prehistory. The selective pressures, the demographic events, they're recent enough that we can sometimes connect them to known historical migrations and climate changes. But perhaps the most remarkable example of rapid skin color evolution is experimental. It hasn't happened yet, but we can predict it will. When humans eventually colonize other planets or live for extended periods in space or underground, they'll face completely novel UV environments. On Mars, surface UV is much higher than Earth because Mars has no protective ozone layer. Underground or in space habitats, UV might be nearly absent. If populations lived in these environments for thousands of years, we'd expect skin color to evolve in response. Martian colonists might evolve darker skin to protect against intense UV. Underground populations might evolve extremely pale skin, since there'd be no selection for UV protection, and possibly selection for maximizing vitamin D synthesis from artificial lights. These are thought experiments for now, but they illustrate how responsive skin color is to environmental change. The speed of skin color evolution also has implications for how we think about race and human diversity. If a trait can change dramatically in just a few thousand years, it's not a marker of deep evolutionary divisions. It's a superficial response to recent environmental conditions. Two populations with very different skin colors might have separated only 10,000 years ago, which is recent in evolutionary terms. Conversely, two populations with similar skin colors might have been separated for 50,000 years, but ended up looking similar through convergent evolution. Skin color tells you about recent UV adaptation, but it tells you almost nothing about deeper evolutionary relationships or overall genetic similarity. This is fundamentally different from how race was historically conceived. That races were essentially subspecies that had been evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years. But skin color evolution is far too rapid for this to be true. The differences we see arose recently, within the time frame of recorded history in some cases. The speed of evolution also means that skin color in any given population is contingent. It's the product of specific historical circumstances, specific migration patterns, specific environmental pressures. Change any of those factors and the outcome would have been different. Europeans aren't inherently pale. They're pale because their ancestors happened to migrate to a low UV environment, happened to adopt agriculture which reduced dietary vitamin D, happened to have the genetic variation necessary for selection to act on, and happened to stay in that environment long enough for selection to drive allele frequencies to current levels. If any of those contingencies had been different, modern Europeans might look different. If agriculture had never arrived in Europe, if European populations had relied more heavily on marine foods, if the climate had been different, the selection pressures would have been different. Skin color would have evolved to a different endpoint, or not evolved much at all. This contingency applies to all human populations. Everyone's skin color is the product of their ancestors' specific evolutionary history. There's nothing inevitable or essential about it. It's adaptive, yes, but it's adapted to specific circumstances that could have been different. Understanding the speed of skin color evolution also helps us appreciate how dynamic human evolution has been overall. But that's not true. Humans are still evolving, still adapting to environments, still being shaped by natural selection. The timescale is thousands of years rather than millions, but it's happening. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk as an adult, evolved in some populations within the last 10,000 years. Adaptations to high altitude evolved in Tibetan populations within the last 3,000 years. Resistance to malaria through genes like sickle cell evolved within the last few thousand years in response to agriculture creating breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Skin color is just the most visible of these recent adaptations, but the lesson is the same. Human evolution didn't stop. It slowed in some ways as culture buffered environmental pressures, but it continues. We're still a species in flux, still responding to our environments, still being shaped by the evolutionary forces that created us. The speed of change reminds us that we're all recent. There are no ancient races, no populations that have been separate since the dawn of humanity. We're all products of migration, mixing, and adaptation over the past 100,000 years, with most of the visible diversity we see arising in just the last 10,000. From an evolutionary perspective, we're practically identical. The differences are skin-deep, recent, and adaptive. Everything else, the vast majority of what makes us human, is shared. So here we are, at the end of this journey through millions of years of human evolution, through continents and climates, and the gradual transformation of our species from dark-skinned Africans to the rainbow of human diversity we see today. And if you've been paying attention, you've probably realized that the simple question we started with, how did humans become white? Humans became white through a combination of migration, mutation, natural selection, gene flow, population bottlenecks, dietary changes, cultural adaptations, and random chance. They became white independently in multiple populations through different genetic mechanisms. They became white recently, within the last 10,000 years in most cases, and in some populations possibly as recently as 3,000 years ago. And they became white for reasons that are primarily about vitamin D and folate, but also involve temperature, sexual selection, metabolism, and factors we probably haven't fully identified yet. But more importantly, the question itself is flawed. Because white isn't a biological category. It's a social construct that we've imposed on a continuous spectrum of variation. The idea that there's a clear division between white people and not white people, that you can look at someone and definitively categorize them into one group or the other. A useful fiction for societies that want to create hierarchies and divisions, but a fiction nonetheless. The science is unambiguous on this point. Skin color varies continuously. It's controlled by dozens of genes with hundreds of variants, creating a smooth gradient from the darkest brown to the palest cream. There are no natural clusters, no obvious breakpoints where one category ends and another begins. Any line you draw is arbitrary, based on social definitions rather than biological reality. And even if you tried to define white genetically by looking at specific alleles rather than appearance, you'd run into immediate problems. The genes that make Europeans pale are different from the genes that make East Asians pale. Some Europeans have dark skin variants at some genes, but light skin variants at others. The genetics doesn't support neat categories any more than the appearance does. This isn't just an academic point. It has real implications for how we think about race, identity, and human diversity. For most of human history, people understood that humans came in different shades, and that those shades correlated roughly with geography. But they didn't have a conception of race as we know it today. They didn't think that skin color indicated fundamental biological differences, or that people could be divided into discrete racial groups with different essences. That idea, race as biology, emerged during the colonial period when European powers were conquering and enslaving people around the world. They needed justification for these atrocities, and they found it in the supposed biological inferiority of darker-skinned peoples. They created elaborate racial hierarchies, pseudo-scientific theories about racial differences in intelligence and morality and civilization. They used these theories to justify slavery, genocide, and exploitation on a massive scale. And these ideas persisted. Even after slavery ended, even after scientific racism was supposedly discredited, the notion that races are real biological categories remained embedded in our cultures and institutions. People continued to believe that skin color indicated something deep and essential about a person, that it correlated with intelligence or character or capability. The science we've explored in this journey completely demolishes these ideas. Skin color is a superficial adaptation to UV radiation. It evolved recently and rapidly in response to environmental pressures. It tells you almost nothing about a person's overall genetic makeup, their ancestry beyond a few thousand years, or any trait other than melanin production and vitamin D synthesis. Two people with the same skin color might be genetically less similar than two people with different skin colors. A dark-skinned person from South India and a dark-skinned person from West Africa have similar skin color through convergent evolution, but are about as genetically different as any two human populations can be. A light-skinned Northern European and a light-skinned East Asian achieved light skin through completely different genetic mechanisms and have been separated for 60,000 years. Conversely, some populations with very different skin colors are closely related. Northern and Southern Europeans, for instance, can differ substantially in skin tone, but share most of their genetic ancestry. The skin color difference evolved recently as populations adapted to different UV levels within Europe. The implication is clear. Race, as it's traditionally conceived, has no biological basis. It's not that racial categories are imprecise or fuzzy at the edges. It's that they don't correspond to any natural divisions in human biology. They're artificial constructs imposed on continuous variation for social and political purposes. This doesn't mean skin color doesn't matter. Obviously, it matters socially. People are treated differently based on skin color in societies with histories of racism. Skin color affects people's opportunities, their experiences, their identities. But these are social facts, not biological ones. They reflect how societies have chosen to organize themselves around visible differences, not any inherent biological significance of those differences. It also doesn't mean there's no such thing as genetic ancestry or population structure. Different human populations do have different genetic characteristics, reflecting their evolutionary histories. You can often tell where someone's ancestors came from by looking at their genome, but these genetic differences don't align with racial categories. The genetic variation within continental populations is greater than the variation between them. For medicine, this matters. There are health conditions that correlate with ancestry. Sickle cell disease is more common in people with West African ancestry. Tay-Sachs disease is more common in Ashkenazi Jews. These correlations exist because of specific genetic variants that happen to be more common in certain populations, not because of race as a broad category. Skin color specifically has medical implications. Dark-skinned people living in high latitudes are at higher risk for vitamin D deficiency. Light-skinned people in high UV environments are at higher risk for skin cancer. But these risks correlate with actual skin pigmentation and UV exposure, not with racial category. A dark-skinned person from East Africa and a dark-skinned person from South India face similar vitamin D challenges in Northern Europe, despite having very different ancestries and different genetic bases for their dark skin. Good medicine requires understanding actual genetic variation and environmental exposure, not crude racial categories. As genomic medicine advances, we're moving toward personalized healthcare based on individual genetic profiles rather than assumed racial categories. This is better science and better medicine. For society, understanding the biology of skin color should fundamentally change how we think about human diversity. Instead of seeing discrete races with essential differences, we should see a single species with superficial variations shaped by recent environmental adaptations. Instead of categories and hierarchies, we should see a spectrum of variation with no natural dividing lines. This doesn't make diversity any less real or important. Human variation is real. Different populations have different evolutionary histories, different cultural traditions, different experiences. But this diversity doesn't map onto biological race. It's far more complex, more interesting, and more beautiful than simple racial categories could ever capture. The story of how humans became white is ultimately a story about adaptation and migration, about populations encountering new environments and evolving to fit them, about the same selective pressures creating similar outcomes through different genetic mechanisms in different populations, about the deep unity of our species underlying the superficial diversity of our appearance. It's a story that's still being written. Populations continue to migrate, mix, and adapt. The genetic landscape of human pigmentation is constantly shifting. As people from different backgrounds have children together, as populations move to new environments with new UV exposures, as cultural practices and diets change. In a globalized world where populations are mixing more than ever before, the future of human skin color is uncertain. Will we homogenize towards some intermediate shade as people from different backgrounds mix? Will we maintain diversity through continued selection in different environments? Will new patterns emerge that we can't currently predict? What's certain is that skin color will continue to be shaped by the same evolutionary forces that created current diversity: natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, mutation. These forces don't stop just because we have modern technology and global migration. They continue operating, subtly shifting allele frequencies, responding to environmental pressures we may not even recognize. But perhaps the most important lesson from this journey is about our shared humanity. Every person alive today descends from the same small population that lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago. We're all Africans, if you go back far enough. The physical differences that seem so important, skin color, hair texture, facial features, these evolved within the last 100,000 years, mostly within the last 50,000, in some cases within the last 10,000. From an evolutionary perspective, we're practically identical. We share over 99.9% of our DNA. The genetic differences between individuals within any population are greater than the average differences between populations. We're one species, recently out of Africa, still closely related despite spreading across the globe. The diversity we see, including skin color diversity, is recent and superficial. It's an evolutionary afterthought, a set of adaptations to local conditions tacked onto our basic human blueprint. What makes us human? Our cognition, our language, our social complexity, our creativity. These are shared across all populations. They're our common heritage. Skin color is just melanin responding to UV. It's biology, not destiny. It doesn't determine intelligence or capability or worth. It doesn't divide us into fundamentally different kinds of people. It's a minor variation in a single system of our bodies, one that happens to be visible and therefore socially significant, but biologically trivial. Understanding this, really understanding it at a deep level, should change how we see each other. Not as members of different races, but as variations on a single theme. Not as fundamentally different, but as superficially diverse. Not as separate groups, but as one family with a shared origin and a shared future. The science of skin color evolution is ultimately the science of human unity. It shows us that beneath the visible differences are deep similarities, that what divides us is recent and shallow, while what unites us is ancient and profound. That we're all part of one ongoing evolutionary story that began in Africa and continues wherever humans live. So when you look at your hand, whatever color it is, remember, that color is adaptation. It's evolution. It's your ancestors' response to the environments they encountered as they spread across the world. It's recent, it's superficial, and it's beautiful, but it's not what makes you human. What makes you human is the same thing that makes every other person human. The shared heritage of our species, written in genes we all carry, connecting us across continents and centuries to our common African origin. And that's the answer to how humans became white. Everything else, everything important, remained the same. We're still one species, one family, variations on a theme that's 200,000 years old, but could be written yesterday for how similar we all are. That's what the science tells us. That's what the evidence shows. And that's what we need to remember when we think about human diversity, race, and what it means to be human in a world where skin comes in many shades but humanity comes in only one form. Sleep well, knowing that wherever you are, whatever you look like, you're part of this story, part of the great human family that walked out of Africa and colonized the world, part of an ongoing evolutionary epic that's still being written with every child born, every population mixing, every adaptation to new environments. You're human. That's all that matters. That's all that's ever mattered.